She walked into her own wedding as if it were a funeral. No one applauded. No one smiled. Hundreds of people stood in silence because they all knew that the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle wasn't a husband. He was a debt collector, and the debt she owed, not money, but her life. But on that wedding night when Cale Moretti, Chicago's most notorious tyrant, pulled her closer, he discovered a truth that would leave even the most fearless person speechless in the darkness. This is the story of Celine Vale and Cale Moretti. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. The rain came in sideways off Lake Michigan, hard and cold and indifferent, the kind of rain that didn't care what it ruined. It hammered the stained glass windows of the Moretti estate until the colored light inside trembled, saints and angels and serpents all bleeding into one another across the marble floor of the grand ballroom, and nobody looked up long enough to notice the beauty of it, because beauty had no business being in this room tonight. 340 people stood in rows between columns of white orchids, politicians, cartel lieutenants, arms dealers who wore Italian suits and shook hands with judges on Sunday afternoons. Cale Moretti had invited every man in Chicago who owed him something, and every man in Chicago owed him something. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. You didn't refuse an invitation to a Moretti wedding. You dressed well, you smiled correctly, and you kept your hands where they could be seen. None of them were smiling now. Cale stood at the end of the aisle with his hands clasped in front of him, still as carved stone. He was 41 years old and looked like a man who had been built from conflict. Broad shoulders, a jaw that had been broken twice and reset imperfectly, a faint scar running from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth that he'd stopped explaining years ago. He wore a black suit with no tie because he refused to let anyone dress him like a groom. He wasn't a groom. He was a creditor. Tonight was a transaction, and he intended everyone in the room to understand that. His second-in-command, Dante Reyes, leaned close from the left side. "She's coming," Dante said, his voice low enough to be a breath. Cale didn't answer. He watched the doors at the far end of the ballroom open inward, and Celine Vale walked through them alone. No father to give her away. Her father was dead, buried in a shallow grave outside the city 3 years ago when Cale's men finally located him. No family standing in the pews. No friends clutching tissues. She came down the aisle the same way a person walks into a room they've already accepted they'll never leave. Not with defiance, not with tears, but with something quieter and more terrible than either. She moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that resistance only extended the suffering. She was wearing pale silk, off-white, almost gray in the low light. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly from her face in a way that looked severe, like she'd done it herself without caring whether it was beautiful, and it wasn't beautiful exactly. But it was striking in a way Cale found himself noticing against his will, the clean architecture of her features, the deliberate blankness she'd constructed over every expression. Her eyes were cast slightly downward, not at the floor, about 3 feet in front of her feet, fixed on some private middle distance that had nothing to do with this room. She reached him. She did not look up. The officiator spoke words that Cale heard without processing. He was watching the way Celine Vale breathed, shallow, controlled, the chest barely moving. The way her hands were folded in front of her, one thumb pressing slowly into the opposite palm. Not from nerves, from something older and more practiced. The way a person presses on a bruise not because it relieves the pain, but because the pain is at least familiar. "Do you take this woman?" "Yes," Cale said flatly, before the sentence finished. A beat of silence moved through the ballroom like a held breath. The officiator looked at Celine. She said, "I do," in a voice so level it was almost nothing. Not a whisper, not trembling, just absent. The words of a person reciting something they learned by rote to survive an exam. The room exhaled. Cale took her hand for the ring. Her fingers were cold. Not cold the way cold fingers are cold in winter. Cold in the specific way of a body that has learned to reroute warmth inward, away from the surface, away from anything that might be touched. He slid the ring onto her finger and released her hand immediately. She didn't look at the ring. She didn't look at him. The officiator declared them married, and somewhere in the crowd someone began clapping, mechanically. And then the room followed suit in the careful, approximate way you applaud at a funeral when someone finishes a eulogy that made you uncomfortable. Kael turned toward the crowd and let them see his face, expressionless, absolute, so that every man in that room understood exactly what this was and what it was not. There would be no misinterpretations. He had married Celine Vale because Victor Vale had cost him his brother's life, and $100 million in weapons contracts and 2 years of war that burned through the city and left bodies in places that still hadn't been found. The Vale bloodline ended tonight in the only way Kael Moretti settled debts, completely and without sentiment. He had not expected to feel anything. He had not yet. The reception lasted 4 hours that felt like 8. Kael stood where he was supposed to stand, drank very little, and watched the room the way he always watched rooms, cataloging exits, measuring angles, tracking the positions of men he didn't fully trust. He did not speak to Celine beyond what was required. She sat beside him at the main table in the same carefully cultivated stillness she'd carried through the ceremony, eating almost nothing, responding to the few guests who approached with precise, uninflected politeness. She was good at it, unnaturally good. At one point, Dante leaned over and said quietly, "She's something, isn't she?" Kael looked at him. Dante cleared his throat and found something else to look at. Around midnight, when the last of the guests had been thanked and removed, Kael's estate manager, Marco, led Celine upstairs to the master suite while 2 of Kael's men flanked the staircase. Not because Kael feared she'd run. He wasn't sure she was capable of running. He'd put security there because he didn't yet know what she was capable of, and Kael Moretti had survived 41 years by treating the unknown with caution. He spent another hour in his study, going through correspondence with Dante and reviewing the week's operations. There was nothing particularly pressing. The city was quiet in the way that followed a demonstration of power, people pulling back into their corners, reassessing positions, deciding whether to be grateful or resentful. Kael preferred grateful. It was more stable. When Dante left and the study was silent, Kael poured 2 fingers of whiskey and stood at the window watching the rain against the glass. He didn't drink it right away. He just held the glass and looked at the city and thought about his brother. Luca had been 26 when he died. He'd been the one person in Kael's life who laughed easily and often, who could walk into a warehouse full of armed men and make 2 of them laugh within 5 minutes. Luca had been the one Kael spent the first 3 years after their father's death, arguing with about whether there was a different way, whether the empire could transform into something less ugly. Luca believed it could. Kael had believed it couldn't. Kael had been right, and Luca had died anyway, and now Kael was left with being right and no one to argue with. He drank the whiskey and went upstairs. The master suite was dark except for 2 candles on the windowsill that Kael had not instructed anyone to light, which meant someone on the household staff had made a romantic assumption he found irritating. He almost blew them out. He didn't. He moved into the room and pulled the door closed behind him. Celine was standing at the window. She'd changed out of the wedding dress. She was wearing a plain dark robe, belted tightly at the waist, and she was looking out at the rain-soaked city skyline with her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't turn when he came in. She heard him. He could tell by the faint tightening of her shoulders. But she didn't turn. "You can have the bed," Kael said. "I'll take the sitting room." Silence. "I'm not," he started. "I know what you're not," she said, still facing the window. Her voice was the same as it had been downstairs. Level. Stripped of inflection. "You made your intentions very clear in the contract." Kael stopped in the middle of the room. The contract. Victor Vale's debts, itemized and translated into a marriage arrangement by 3 lawyers and 1 accountant. Celine had been given a copy 6 weeks ago through an intermediary and had signed it without objection or counteroffer, which had struck Kael at the time as either very intelligent or very broken, and he hadn't been sure which. "Then we understand each other," he said. "We do." He moved toward the sitting room door. He was 3 steps away from it when he stopped. He couldn't explain afterward why he stopped. The room was warm. The candles moved the shadows slowly, and there was something in the specific quality of her stillness, the way she stood at the window as if she were holding herself together by a set of internal mechanics he couldn't see, that snagged in him like a hook through cloth. "Are you cold?" he asked. It was a stupid question. He didn't ask stupid questions. A long pause. "I'm fine," she said. That wasn't the question. Another pause, different in texture. I'm always cold, she said. And something in the way she said it, simple, factual, with no bid for sympathy in it at all, landed in the room differently than he expected. Kael looked at her back. The robe was loose at the collar, shifted slightly to one side, and in the candlelight he could see, or thought he could see, something at the edge of her shoulder blade. A line, too precise for a natural mark. He crossed the room. She heard him coming. Her shoulders tightened further, but she didn't move, and he understood with a clarity that arrived before thought that she wasn't being still because she trusted him. She was being still because she had learned that stillness was the safest response to a man moving toward her from behind. That understanding landed in his chest like something dropped from a height. He stopped 2 feet behind her. "Look at me," he said. She turned, slowly. Her eyes came up to his face, dark brown, steady, giving nothing. And he could see now that the blankness wasn't indifference. It was armor. Specifically constructed, deliberately maintained armor. The kind that takes years to build and costs more to sustain than most people understand. He said, "Take off the robe." Her jaw tightened fractionally. One small movement, quickly controlled. "The contract." "I'm not touching you," he said. "I want to see your shoulder." A long moment passed between them. The rain was loud against the glass. One of the candles sputtered. Then Celine reached up and pulled the robe back off her left shoulder. The candlelight fell across her skin. Cale Moretti had seen a great many things in his life that he wished he hadn't. Execution rooms, war sites, the aftermath of things he had ordered and things that had been ordered against him. He was not a man who looked away from difficult things. He had trained himself out of that reflex years ago on the grounds that looking away was a form of dishonesty, and dishonesty got people killed. But he stood very still now, looking at the scars on Celine Vale's shoulder and back, and for the first time in a long time, something in him went quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. Thin white lines across her ribs, old enough to be fully healed, too numerous and too regular to be anything other than deliberate. A pattern of circular burns near her spine, 4, 5, 6 of them, the specific diameter of a cigarette. Long diagonal marks across her lower back, deeper than the others, the kind that required something with an edge and force behind it. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Celine stared straight ahead at the window, jaw set, as if enduring a medical examination. She had the expression of someone who had shown these scars before, under conditions that made her feel less than human, and had decided that the way to survive showing them again was to be absent from the moment entirely. "Cover up," Kael said quietly. She pulled the robe back into place with practiced efficiency. Kael stepped back. He turned away from her and walked to the window himself, putting space between them, looking out at the city lights smeared by rain into long yellow streaks across the wet black glass. His brother used to say that the worst thing about evil wasn't the violence of it. It was the patience. How it hid behind respectable faces and went on for years and years while everyone looked the other way. Kael pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. "How long?" he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Behind him, Celine was silent for a moment. "Since I was 14, she said. The window fogged slightly under his hand. He didn't turn around. He didn't trust his face right now, and he had long understood that there was a specific kind of rage that helped no one, the kind that arrived too late, when the damage was already finished, when the only thing it could consume was the person already surviving it. "Who?" he said. She didn't answer. "Celine." "That's not something we agreed to discuss," she said, and her voice carried the faintest edge of something now. Not defiance exactly, but resistance. The kind that comes from a person who has learned that sharing the name only extends the danger. Kael turned. She was looking at him directly for the first time all night, and he could see what it cost her. The chin lifted, the jaw firm, the shoulders squared, all of it a performance of composure built over a foundation of something that had been cracked and cracked again and somehow kept standing. "You're right," he said. "It's not." He walked to the sitting room door, opened it, and stopped in the frame. "The door between us locks from your side," he said. "There are 2 additional guards at the top of the stairs. If you need anything, you knock on this door or you call Dante's extension. It's written on the card by the phone." She didn't respond. "Celine." "I heard you," she said. He went through the door and pulled it shut behind him. He stood in the sitting room for a long moment in the dark, listening to the rain, feeling the specific weight of a night that had not gone the way he'd constructed it. He'd spent 3 years building the architecture of this revenge. The patience of it, the precision, the cold satisfaction he'd promised himself would arrive when Victor Vale's last surviving debt was finally, formally collected. What arrived instead was something he had no architecture for. He sat down in the chair by the sitting room window and did not sleep for a very long time. By 6 in the morning, the rain had slowed to a gray drizzle, and Kyle was at his desk with coffee and a clean sheet of paper. He wrote one name at the top, Vernon Crowe. Vernon Crowe was a name Kyle knew, though not well. A federal judge, appointed 12 years ago, respected in the circles that traded on respectability. He had appeared twice in Kyle's intelligence files as a peripheral figure, someone who moved in the orbit of power without being quite central enough to require direct management. He had a public reputation for prosecuting organized crime, which Kyle had always found mildly amusing given that organized crime financed half the judicial appointments in the city. But the irony had never been personal until now. Now it was very personal. Kyle wrote, "Celine Vale, stepfather, since age 14. He underlined it once. Then he picked up the phone and called Dante. "I need a complete background on Vernon Crowe," he said when Dante picked up on the second ring. "Not the public file. Everything, every property, every connection, every account that has ever touched his name. I want it before noon." Dante, who had long ago stopped being surprised by Kyle's early morning requests, said simply, "How deep?" "Floor," Kyle said. He hung up and looked at the name on the paper. Outside the window, Chicago was gray and wet, and beginning its morning in the way cities do, without acknowledging the night, without asking what happened in the dark hours, without caring what had changed between the rain starting and the rain stopping. Kyle tapped the pen against the desk twice. He had married Celine Vale to close an account. What he was beginning to understand with the slow, unpleasant clarity of a man who deals only in facts was that the account he'd been keeping was the wrong one entirely. And the man who actually owed a debt that made Victor Vale's betrayal look like a misunderstanding between business partners, had been sitting inside the city's legal system for over a decade, wearing a judge's robe, collecting a government salary, and walking around in the open air. Kyle stood up from the desk and moved to the window. Dante called back at 9:42 with the first layer of it, and even across a phone line, Kyle could hear the shift in Dante's voice. A tightening, a controlled revulsion that told Kyle the information was worse than the working hypothesis. "It's not just Celine," Dante said. "There are other names. At least 8 women in a 20-year window that trace back to properties Crowe controlled. 2 of them disappeared. One is in a psychiatric facility in Indiana under a false name that connects back to a shell company that connects back to Crowe's brother-in-law's law firm." The room was very quiet. "There's more," Dante said. "The trafficking network. It's not small, Kyle. It's infrastructure, judges, police commanders, 2 names I recognize from city council. This is a machine. It's been running for 20 years. Kyle said nothing. "The woman you married," Dante continued carefully, "was not a peripheral victim. She was, from what I can reconstruct, being positioned. There are transfers from Crowe's accounts to an intermediary we traced to a syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard. He was going to sell her." The pen in Kyle's hand cracked. He looked down. He'd snapped it at the midpoint without noticing. There was ink across his fingers, dark blue bleeding into the lines of his palm. "When," he said, and his voice was very level, the way his voice got when the thing that needed controlling was too large for his usual registers. "The timeline is unclear, but based on the account activity, within the next few months, before she turned 25, there seems to have been a deadline." "She found out," Kyle said slowly, "or she suspected." A pause from Dante. "That's my read, too." Kyle looked at the ink on his hand. He thought about the contract. 6 weeks ago. Signed without objection or counteroffer, which had struck him as either very intelligent or very broken. Not broken. Strategic. Celine Vale had signed that contract because being collected as a debt by the most feared man in Chicago was safer than what was coming for her from the man she was already living with. She had traded one cage for another, and she had done it with clear eyes and no illusions, because she was a woman who had learned that you survive by identifying which cage has a lock you might eventually be able to reach. Cale set the broken pen down very carefully on the desk. "Where's Crow right now?" he said. "Federal courthouse. He has hearings all week." "Good. I don't want him to know we're looking. Tell your people to be invisible." "Understood." A beat. Kyle. "What? She doesn't know what we found?" "No." Another beat. "Are you going to tell her?" Kyle looked out the window at the gray city, at the rain-slicked streets and the ordinary morning that had no idea what was moving through it. "Not yet," he said. "Not until I know all of it." He ended the call and stayed at the window for a long moment, thinking about the specific quality of patience required by a man who has been living inside a machine that was going to kill him and had still managed to find a way out. Then he thought about Vernon Crow in a federal courthouse, in a black robe, with a gavel. The rage came then. Not the disorganized kind, not the kind that burned without direction, but the cold, specific architectural kind that Kyle Moretti was very good at, the kind that could wait, the kind that built things. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "Tell my wife breakfast is ready when she's ready," he said, "and tell her she can move freely through the house. She's not a prisoner." A pause from Marco, who had also worked for Kyle long enough to know when something had shifted. "Of course," Marco said. Kyle hung up. He stood at his desk and looked again at the single name written on the clean sheet of paper, and he drew a slow, deliberate line under it a second time. Somewhere upstairs, on the other side of a locked door, Celine Vale was either sleeping or, more likely, sitting in the same precise stillness she'd occupied since he'd met her, waiting to see what would happen next, doing the exhausting, invisible labor of a person who has learned never to assume safety. She did not know yet that someone was coming for her from outside these walls. She did not know that the machine that had been built around her life was accelerating. She did not know that the man she'd signed a contract with to escape one nightmare was, at this exact moment, deciding something about her future that had nothing to do with debt collection and everything to do with the debt of a completely different kind. The kind that doesn't go in ledgers. Kale folded the sheet of paper and put it in his jacket pocket and walked out of the study into the long rain-gray corridor of his estate. And something in his chest that had been cold and deliberate for 3 years was doing something he didn't have a precise word for, something between ignition and dread. Something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of a thing he had not planned for. That was the part that concerned him most. Kyle Moretti didn't do unplanned things. He needed to get ahead of this. He needed information, leverage, angles of approach. He needed to understand the full architecture of what Crow had built before Crow realized that the woman he'd been planning to sell had just become the wife of the one man in Chicago who had both the means and the motivation to burn the entire structure to the ground. But first, Crow needed to not know. And then Kyle turned the corner at the end of the corridor and found Celine Vale standing at the top of the stairs. She was dressed now. Dark clothes, her hair loose, a cup of something warm held in both hands, and she was looking down the staircase at the front door of the estate with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the controlled blankness, not the armor, something alert, watchful. The expression of an animal that has sensed a change in the air before any visible sign has arrived. Kyle stopped. She turned and looked at him. "Vernon called the house," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened around the cup. 20 minutes ago. Marco told me. The corridor was very quiet. "What did he say?" Kyle said. Celine held his gaze with an effort that was almost visible, like watching someone hold a door against a wind they didn't want the room to feel. "He said congratulations," she said, "and he said he'd be in touch." Kyle looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the phone call to Dante, the names, the timeline, the account transfers moving toward a deadline. He thought about a 20-year machine that had just been informed through a simple social announcement in the newspaper society pages that the most important piece of its current operation had moved locations. And he thought about the fact that Vernon Crow was a man who had survived 2 decades of maintaining a secret by eliminating anything that threatened to expose it. "Come downstairs," Kyle said. "We need to talk." Celine looked at him for another moment. Reading him, he understood, the way someone reads a room before entering it. And then she nodded once and came down the stairs. Whatever conversation they were about to have, Kael knew, would end with her knowing things about her own life that she hadn't known an hour ago. And when she knew them, everything between them would change. Again. The dining room of the Moretti estate was large enough to seat 20 people, and this morning it held 2, which made the space feel less like a room and more like a decision waiting to be made. Kael sat at the head of the table. He had not touched the coffee Marco placed in front of him. He was watching Celine settle into the chair 2 seats down from him. Not across, not beside, but at a diagonal that preserved distance while allowing eye contact, a positioning he noted as either unconscious habit or calculated geometry and couldn't yet determine which. She wrapped both hands around her cup again. That detail lodged in him. She held things in both hands. Coffee cups, wine glasses, the edge of a tablecloth at the wedding reception. As if she'd learned not to trust surfaces to stay where you put them. Marco appeared in the doorway. "Leave us," Kael said. Marco disappeared without sound. That was what Kael paid him for. Celine was looking at the table, not down at it, a neutral middle distance that she occupied the way some people occupy waiting rooms. Kael leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a moment before he started, taking inventory of what he knew and what he was about to give away by telling her any of it. Information was currency, and he had spent 30 years being very careful about which currency he spent in which room. But there was a calculation here that overrode habit. She already knew Vernon was circling. She had heard it in a congratulatory phone call and recognized the specific frequency of it. The kind of contact that says, "I know where you are," while pretending to say something else. She knew the shape of the threat even without the dimensions. He needed her to know the dimensions. "Your stepfather," he said. "How much do you know about what he does?" Celine looked up, slowly, like someone raising a weight. "I know enough," she said. "That's not an answer." A beat. Her jaw shifted slightly to the left. A small movement, reset quickly. "I know he has connections he shouldn't have for a federal judge," she said. "I know money comes in from places that aren't on any record I ever saw. I know that women came to the house and didn't always leave the same way they arrived." She paused. "Is that enough, or do you need me to list it?" Kael studied her face, the flatness of it, the control. 26 years old, and she'd developed the kind of economy of expression that took most people decades in operational environments to learn, and she'd learned it in a household. "What do you know about the network?" he said. Something changed in her eyes. Not fear. She was past fear as a first response, he was beginning to understand. Something closer to recognition, the way you recognize a name you weren't supposed to hear. "What network?" she said. "You know what network." "I want to hear you say it." He looked at her for a moment, then, "Trafficking. Movement of women across state lines and beyond, financed through shell companies that route back to your stepfather and a consortium of men in positions that give them access to both supply chains and legal protection." The cup in her hands didn't move. She was very still. "For how long has your family known?" she said. "We didn't. Until this morning." A pause. Something processed behind her eyes, fast and invisible, like computation. "You investigated him," she said. "I investigated the scars on your back," Kael said. "He came with them." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the particular silence of a room in which something honest has been said, and both people present are adjusting to the weight of it. Celine set her cup down. She lined it up with the edge of her placemat with a precision that looked like it cost her something. "There's more," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Tell me." Kael measured the moment. Then he said, "He was planning to sell you. Within the next few months, there are transfers in his accounts that trace to a syndicate on the eastern seaboard. The timeline was advancing before you—" He paused almost imperceptibly. "Before you signed the contract." Celine didn't move. The morning light came through the high windows at a low angle and caught the side of her face, and Kael watched her process what he'd just said. Not with shock. He watched for shock and it didn't come, which told him something important. She'd already known. Not the specific details, not the account transfers, but the shape of it. The approaching deadline, the change in her stepfather's behavior in the months before the contract was offered. She'd felt it closing in before she could name it. She'd signed the contract to get out. He'd known that this morning at the desk with the ink on his hand, but watching her face confirm it without a single word made it land differently in the room. He called this morning to establish that he knows your location, Kyle said. That means he's already recalibrating. He lost the asset, and now he's deciding whether to cut exposure or try to recover it. Celine looked at him directly. I'm not an asset. That's not how I used the word. You used it. I used his framing, Kyle said, so you'd understand the level of the threat accurately. A pause. She looked at him, reading him again, that same careful inventory she'd taken at the top of the stairs, and seemed to find something in it that was, if not comfortable, at least consistent with what she expected. What does he do to people who expose him? She said. You already know. I want your read on it. He removes them, Kyle said, quietly, when he can, loudly when he can't. 2 women in the last 20 years connected to his properties are missing. One is alive in a facility in Indiana under a name that isn't hers. Celine absorbed this without expression. Indiana, she said quietly. You knew about her. I knew someone. I didn't know where she went. A pause. Her name is Carla. She stopped herself, pressed her lips together briefly. That doesn't matter right now. It might, Kale said. Later. Celine picked up her cup again, both hands, looked at the middle distance for a moment. So he knows I'm here, she said. He knows who I married, and he knows that if I talk, his machine comes down. Yes. Which means he can't let me talk. Which means, Kyle said, that the window between his first move and our preparation is very short, and we are behind it. Celine looked at him. You said R, she said. Kale didn't respond to that immediately. He picked up his coffee finally, found it had gone cold, set it back down. Last night, he said carefully, I came into this house with a specific idea about what this arrangement was. That idea was wrong. The information was wrong. The debt I've been carrying is against the wrong person. He paused. That doesn't sit well with me. Because you made a mistake, Celine said. Not cruelly, flatly. Because I made a mistake, he confirmed. She watched him. And now you want to fix it. I want to finish it. There's a difference. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. Something in between that was too tired to be either. You should know, she said, that I'm not in the habit of trusting people who tell me they want to protect me. I know. The last man who said something like that, I know, Kyle said. The directness of it stopped her. She looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't hostility, but wasn't far from it, a suspended judgment held carefully, waiting. What do you want from me? She said. Right now? Nothing. Eat breakfast. She blinked. It was the closest thing to a spontaneous reaction he'd gotten from her. Later, he continued, I may need information. Things you know about his operation, his contacts, his properties. When and if that moment comes, I'll ask and you'll decide. Not before. Another pause. All right, she said. Dante arrived at the estate at 11 with a man named Oscar Freed, who was not introduced by last name or professional title, but who carried a laptop and smelled faintly of cigarettes and server rooms, and had the specific pale complexion of someone who spent most of his hours inside buildings doing things that required deniable expertise. Kale met them in the study. He left the door open. Oscar spread the laptop on the desk and pulled up an architecture of connected names and accounts that looked, on the screen, like a map of something organic, a root system, a vascular diagram, the branching logic of a thing grown over years rather than designed in a single moment. 22 years, Oscar said, tracing a line from a central node outward with one finger. Crow built the foundation before his appointment, used the appointment to give the structure legal insulation. Every horizontal connection you see here is either a current judge, a law enforcement commander, or a municipal official with direct budgetary authority over vice units. Dante stood to the side with his arms crossed and said nothing. Kyle looked at the map. Entry points, he said. 3, that I can find, Oscar said. 2 in law enforcement, 1 in city council. They can be turned, but it requires leverage, significant leverage, the kind that takes time to develop. We don't have time, Kyle said. Oscar looked at him with the expression of a man who knows things he'd prefer not to know. "There's one other way," he said. "Physical evidence. If Crow kept records, and men like this always keep records, either from paranoia or as insurance, and if those records could be accessed before he moves them—" "Where?" Kyle said. "Primary residence, West Side property, but that's heavily secured, and if he suspects surveillance—" "He does," Kyle said. "He called this house this morning." Oscar closed his eyes briefly. "Then the clock is shorter than I estimated." Dante unfolded his arms. "How short?" "Days," Oscar said. "Maybe less. A man with 22 years of exposure at stake who has just identified a specific threat doesn't wait to see what happens. He accelerates." Cale said, "Get me the layout of the West Side property." Oscar nodded and started typing. Cale turned and saw Celine in the doorway. She had not been there a moment ago. She had come down the hallway quietly enough that no one in the study had registered her approach, which meant she moved through the house with a practiced silence she probably didn't notice in herself anymore. She was looking at the laptop screen from the doorway, at the diagram, at the network of names spreading across it, and her face was doing the thing again, that controlled processing, but there was something underneath it now, something that had a color he hadn't seen on her before. It took him a second to identify it. Recognition. "You've seen this before," he said. She lifted her eyes from the screen to him. "Not this," she said. "But part of it. He had files." She came 2 steps into the room, her arms crossed in front of her chest, not defensively but in the way of someone who has walked into cold air. "At the house on Mercer Street, in the basement, there was a server. I saw it twice by accident, and both times I was redirected, very firmly." Cale looked at Dante. Dante looked at Oscar. Oscar said, "Mercer Street isn't the West Side property." "No," Celine said. "The West Side property is where he lives. Mercer Street is where he works." A pause. "I don't think anyone outside his network knows that address belongs to him. It's registered to a holdings company under 3 layers of shell corporations." Oscar's fingers went still on the keyboard. He turned slowly to look at her. "How do you know that?" he said. Celine looked at Kyle, not Oscar. "Because I found the paperwork when I was 17, she said. "And I kept a copy." The study was very quiet. Cale looked at her across the room, and the specific quality of the silence between them shifted. Something tightening, clarifying, the way a diagnosis changes the nature of symptoms you've been observing and gives them structure. She hadn't just escaped, she had been preparing. "Where's the copy?" he said. "Not here," she said. "Hidden. From before." She paused. "There's more than paperwork. I recorded things. When I was 17 and again at 19, audio, some video. I hid the files on a server I set up myself at a location he doesn't know about." Oscar looked like a man whose professional estimation of a situation had just been restructured in real time. Dante said quietly, "How much?" Celine looked at the diagram on the laptop. "Enough," she said. "Names, payments, dates, faces." Her voice was completely level, but Kyle could see what it cost her, the slight tightening along her jaw, the way her thumbnail was pressing into the pad of her index finger. "I kept adding to it for years, every time I could do it without being caught. I didn't know what to do with it. I just kept it. Because I thought someday—" She stopped, looked at the window. "I thought someday I'd be in a position where I could use it without being destroyed for using it." Cale said, "Where is the server?" She told him the address. It was in the south side. A storage unit she'd rented at 19 under a false name using cash, registered to a P.O. box she'd never connected to any real address. Oscar wrote it down. Dante said, "If Crow is already moving, he may have people watching her known locations." "The storage unit isn't known," Celine said. "I've never told anyone. Ever." A pause. "I didn't tell you for the same reason." "But you're telling me now," Kyle said. She looked at him steadily. "You just told me he was going to sell me. I think that changes the calculation." Cale studied her face for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Dante," he said, "get 3 men to that address. Clean. No connection to this house. Drive something unremarkable. Retrieve whatever is on the storage unit and bring it directly here. On it, Dante said, and moved for the door. And Dante stopped. Tell them to be fast, Kyle said. Sam. The afternoon went badly in increments. At 2:15, one of Kyle's contacts in the Chicago PD, a lieutenant named Sorrell, who had been on Moretti payroll for 6 years, called to report that someone had placed a surveillance order on the Moretti estate. Not official. A private contractor running vehicle plates and monitoring communication frequencies through equipment registered to a security firm that, when Kyle had Oscar pull the registration within 40 minutes, traced back through 4 entities to a holding company connected to a law firm that appeared 3 times in the network diagram on Oscar's laptop. He's watching the house, Dante said. He was watching before he called, Kyle said. The call was to confirm I'd answer. Celine was in the kitchen when Kyle found her at 3 o'clock. She was standing at the counter with a glass of water, not drinking it, looking at the wall. She heard him come in and turned, and he saw that the composure she'd maintained since morning had thinned in places, like paint on a surface that's been stressed. Your men aren't back yet, she said. They will be. What if the unit's been found? Then we adjust. He moved to the counter and leaned against it, keeping a deliberate distance. Have you eaten since breakfast? She blinked at the apparent irrelevance of the question. Don't do that, she said. Do what? The human thing. When you're managing a crisis, it's disorienting. Kyle looked at her for a moment. I'm not doing anything. You haven't eaten. She looked at the water glass, set it down, crossed her arms, uncrossed them. I'm fine, she said. You said that last night. It was true last night, too. He opened the refrigerator, pulled out a container of leftover rice Marco had left labeled in neat handwriting, put it in the microwave, and set the timer without asking her anything. She watched this sequence with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not gratitude, not quite resentment, something suspended in between, like a person watching someone do an ordinary thing in a context that made ordinary things strange. The microwave ran. I need to ask you something, Kyle said. She waited. The evidence on the server, is there anything in it that could be used against you? She was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? If it gets into the wrong hands, if Crow's lawyers get access to it before we can use it properly, is there anything in those files that he could weaponize against you specifically? She looked at the microwave. There are recordings of me, she said carefully, from when I was underage. He kept his own records, which I copied. Some of what's on those files, I'm in them. Not willingly, but in them. The microwave beeped. Kale opened it, took out the container, set a fork beside it on the counter without comment. If that material gets exposed, he said, we control the context. Who sees it? In what sequence? Through which channels? It doesn't leave this house without going through Oscar first, and it doesn't go public without your explicit permission. Non-negotiable. She was looking at the container of food. You're saying that like it's a given, she said. It is a given. Why? Kale picked up his own glass of water, drank, set it down. Because it should be. She looked at him for a long moment with that suspended expression. Reading, calculating, waiting for the catch she'd learned to expect from every declaration of safety ever made to her. When the catch didn't present itself, something in her face didn't exactly soften, but changed register, like a frequency shifting by a fraction. She picked up the fork and ate standing at the counter. Kale didn't say anything. He stood nearby and let her eat in whatever version of quiet she needed, and the kitchen held them both in the low gray afternoon light, without requiring anything from either of them. Dante's men came back at 4:47. They came back without the server. Kyle was in the study when Dante walked in, and the expression on Dante's face, controlled, tight, the specific set of a man delivering news he'd prepared language for, told Kyle everything before the words did. Storage unit was empty, Dante said, cleaned out. Recently, within the last 12 hours based on the dust patterns, whatever was on the server, it's gone. Kale said nothing. There's more, Dante said. One of my men spotted a tail on the way back. We lost them before returning to the estate, but they'll have gotten a partial on the vehicle. Which means they know we went to the unit, Kyle said. Which means they were already watching it. Kyle turned to the window. If they were watching the storage unit, it meant they knew about it. If they knew about it, they'd been ahead of Celine's contingency plan for some unknown period of time, which meant the insurance she'd spent years building had been compromised. Possibly recently, possibly much earlier. Which meant that when Crow called this morning, it wasn't just to establish location. It was to tell her, in the only language she'd understand, that he already had what she had. He'd taken her leverage. Kael turned from the window. "Where is she?" "Library," Dante said. "I checked before coming in." Kael moved toward the door. "Kael." Dante's voice had a quality he used rarely. Not urgency exactly, but the near neighbor of it. "There's one more thing. Lieutenant Sorrell called while my men were in transit. 3 bodies turned up this afternoon in the River District. 2 of them are names I recognize from Crow's network, men who've been connected to the operation for years. The third," Dante paused. "The third is a woman. No ID yet, but the description matches someone in the files Oscar pulled, one of the 8 names in the 20-year window." Kael stopped in the doorframe. "Crow is eliminating exposure," Dante said. "Not gradually, systematically. He's cleaning up." Kael stood in the frame without speaking for several seconds. "How fast?" he said. "Based on the pace of today? Within 48 hours he could be dark. Every physical connection, every living witness, every piece of loose evidence, gone. And then he's untouchable." Dante paused. "He still has political protection. If we wait too long to move, he'll have enough cover to come after this house directly through legal channels. Freeze assets. Put the estate under warrant. Manufacture something." Hale thought about the stored evidence. Gone. He thought about the women in the 20-year window and the one whose description matched a name in the files and who was being pulled out of the river this afternoon, while a federal judge in a secure office somewhere in the city ordered the next name on a list. He thought about Celine standing at the kitchen counter eating rice with both hands on a fork, while the safety net she'd spent years threading together was being cut one strand at a time. "Get Oscar," Kael said. "Tell him I need every property, every vehicle, every digital communication trail Crow has used in the last 6 months. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs." Dante nodded. "And get me Sorrell on a clean line," Kael said. "Not the usual channel." Dante raised an eyebrow fractionally. "The usual channel is compromised," Kael said. "Crow's surveillance order came through somewhere. I don't know yet where the leak is, but until I do, we use nothing that's touched regular operations." Dante nodded again and left. Kael walked to the library. Yeah. Celine was sitting in a chair by the far window with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when he came in. Took in his face with the speed of someone practiced at reading rooms for danger. "They didn't find it," she said. Not a question. "No." She closed the book, set it aside, looked at the window. "He took it," she said. "Yes. I should have moved it. I kept thinking about moving it, and I—" She stopped, her jaw tightened. "I kept thinking I had more time." "This isn't your fault," Kael said. She looked at him sharply. "Don't. I'm not managing you. I'm stating a fact." "He got there first," she said. "Whatever I had, he has it now, which means—" She stopped again, and this time what crossed her face was something different from everything she'd shown him in the last 18 hours. Something rawer, faster, less controlled. "Which means he's going to use it, not to expose himself, to preempt me, to make sure that if I ever do talk, there's a version of the story already in existence that—" She cut herself off. "He's done it before, to other people. He builds a narrative in advance. He gets ahead of the accusation. And then when the accusation comes, he already has the counter ready and the people ready to carry it. And—" She pressed the heel of her hand to her sternum and stopped talking. Kael crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, not beside her, not looming over her, but at a level below her eye line. It was a deliberate positioning. He needed her looking down at him, not up. "Look at me," he said. She looked down. Her eyes were dry. She was holding everything behind them by force of habit and long practice. "He doesn't have everything," Kael said. "He has what was in the unit. He doesn't have you. He doesn't have what you remember, and he doesn't have what we're going to build from what we already know." "What we already know isn't enough to touch him," she said. He has protection from people in law enforcement and the judiciary. You said so. He does, Kyle said, which means we don't use law enforcement and the judiciary. She looked at him. Then how? She said. Kyle held her gaze. There's a gala next week, he said. Blackthorn Hotel. Charity function. Crow will be there. He's always there. It's one of his primary social venues. Half the men in his network will be in that room. Celine went very still. No, she said. I'm not asking you to confront him. I'm asking you to be present. In a room where he has to perform civility. Where every camera in the city will be. I said no. Her voice was low and flat and completely immovable. You don't understand what it's like to be in a room with him. You don't understand. You're right, Kyle said. I don't. The simplicity of it stopped her. I don't understand what it costs you to be near him, Kyle said. And I'm not pretending to. But I need you to understand that within 48 hours, he will have neutralized enough of the existing evidence that moving against him through any channel we currently have access to becomes effectively impossible. After that point, a room full of cameras and witnesses is one of the few environments where his behavior can be documented in real time, where we have a chance. Celine looked at him for a long moment. The library was quiet. Outside the windows, the city was doing its gray afternoon business, indifferent as it always was to the specific arrangements of private catastrophe occurring inside its buildings. You're asking me to be bait, she said. I'm asking you to be visible, Kyle said. There's a difference. She looked at him. Something turned over behind her eyes. Not decision yet, but the terrain preliminary to it. The assessment of stakes, the weighing of costs, the particular calculation of a person who has spent years choosing between things that all hurt in different ways. If I go, she said, I need to know that if he gets within 10 feet of me, he won't, Kyle said. That's not a guarantee. No, Kyle said. It isn't. She looked at the window. Her thumbnail was pressing into her index finger again. Slow, rhythmic, automatic. I'll think about it, she said. Kyle nodded and stood. He moved toward the door. He was almost through it when her voice came behind him. Quiet, stripped of its usual architecture. He's going to send someone before the gala, she said. He always moves before people expect him to. He won't wait. Kale turned. She was looking at her hands. He sent someone to the last person who threatened him, she said. A woman. Her name was Delphine. She was going to go to the press. A pause. They found her car outside the city. They never found her. Kale stayed in the doorframe. I know what I signed myself into, Celine said. She looked up. I knew when I signed the contract. I'm not asking you to protect me from the reality of what this is. She paused. I want to know if you have a plan, a real one, not a reaction. A plan. Kale looked at her across the library. I'm building it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Build faster, she said. He left the room. He was halfway down the corridor when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Dante's name. A single word below it. Incoming. Kyle stopped walking. 3 seconds later, the first explosion hit the east perimeter of the estate. A concussive thud that traveled through the floor and up through his feet and rattled the paintings on the corridor walls. And then the alarm system activated, and every light in the estate shifted to emergency red, and somewhere outside men were shouting, and somewhere in the library behind him, Celine Vale was on her feet before the echo finished. It had begun. The explosion took out the east wall of the estate's ground floor utility corridor. Not a structural charge, not something designed to bring down the building, but a breach charge, the specific kind used to open a path rather than destroy a target, and Kale recognized the distinction in the first 3 seconds after the impact traveled through the floor and into his feet because he had used that exact configuration himself on 17 different occasions. And the sound of your own methodology coming back at you has a particular quality that is worse than unfamiliar violence. He moved back towards the library before the echo finished. Celine was already on her feet when he came through the door. She'd overturned the chair, not from the blast deliberately, putting furniture between herself and the window, and she was standing with her back against the interior wall, shoulders flat against the plaster, in a position that a person only knows to take if they've already thought through what happens when a room becomes dangerous. Her eyes found him immediately. East side, he said. Breach. Not a bomb. They want access, not demolition. She nodded once, processing, not panicking. He registered this somewhere that wasn't quite the front of his mind and kept moving. "Come with me," he said. "Stay close. Stay behind me. Don't speak unless I ask you something directly." She came off the wall and followed him into the corridor without hesitation and without questions, which told him everything about how many times she'd rehearsed an exit from a bad situation in her head. The estate's emergency layout had 3 interior safe corridors, a design Kyle had commissioned after the warehouse war 3 years ago, when he'd understood definitively that any building you sleep in needs to be survivable from the inside. He moved them into the first corridor, a reinforced passage running parallel to the east wing, and pulled his phone out. Dante picked up on the first half ring. "Report," Kyle said. 3 men breached the east utility access. My guys hit 2 of them immediately. Third is inside, somewhere between the laundry corridor and the east stairwell. Armed, professional. These aren't street-hired guns. A pause and the sound of something, impact, movement, shouting in the distance. There's also a vehicle situation at the front gate. 2 cars. They rammed the secondary barrier. Giacomo's team is holding, but we're thin on the east. Where's Oscar? Server room locked in. He's fine. Keep him there. I need him functional after this. Kyle moved them further down the interior corridor, putting 3 reinforced doors between their position and the breach point. The third intruder. Description: tall, tactical gear, no markings, moves like someone who's done this for a living. Not Crow's usual contractors, Kyle said. No, different quality. Celine was directly behind him, her breathing controlled and close. He could feel the warmth of it on the back of his neck, measured and deliberate. She was slowing her breath consciously, working against the body's instinct to accelerate, which took a specific kind of practiced discipline. I need a clean exit on the west side, Kyle said into the phone. 2 people, within 6 minutes. Working on it. Give me 4. Kale ended the call and stopped at a junction point in the corridor. He turned and looked at Celine. In the red emergency lighting, her face had the quality of a photograph. High contrast, flattened, the shadows in her eye sockets making her expression harder to read than usual. Are you hurt? He said. No. Can you run if you need to? Yes. Have you ever used a firearm? A pause that was exactly 1 second long. Yes, she said. He reached to the side panel mounted on the corridor wall, a locked case, key code, open in 2 seconds, and withdrew a compact handgun. He held it out to her grip first. She looked at it for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. Then she took it. She checked the chamber with the automatic efficiency of someone who learned to do it correctly and did it correctly every time without thinking about it. She found the safety and confirmed its position. She held it low and close, muzzle down, the way you hold something you're prepared to use but aren't waving around. Kyle looked at her. She looked at him. Who taught you? He said. I taught myself, she said, when I was 20, from a manual I found and a range I paid cash to use, because I decided I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life without being able to protect myself. The corridor was quiet except for the distant sounds of his men managing the east side. Good, Kyle said. He moved and she stayed close behind him, and they went through the west corridor toward the secondary exit that Dante was preparing, and the building held them inside its emergency geometry while outside the rain had started again, or maybe it had never stopped, hitting the high windows in long, cold sheets that sounded like static. They were out of the estate and into the second vehicle within 11 minutes of the first explosion. It was a nondescript gray sedan driven by one of Dante's men named Price, who said nothing and drove with the specific, focused blankness of someone executing a task rather than participating in a situation. They went west through service streets and then south on a secondary route that avoided the 3 most surveilled corridors in the city. Dante was in the passenger seat. He turned to look at both of them as the estate disappeared behind them. 2 confirmed dead on my side, he said. 1 intruder in custody. The front gate team retreated. We didn't hold both positions. Kale said, The estate. Compromised for now. I've got a secondary location ready. 30 minutes out. Kyle nodded and looked out the window. Celine sat beside him with the gun in her lap and her hands loose and her eyes tracking the streets as they passed, reading the environment, cataloging exits, doing the same thing he was doing from a different angle. He noticed it, and she didn't seem to notice him noticing, and that was fine. "The intruder in custody," Kyle said. "Where?" "Giacomo has him in the East Wing storeroom. The man is mobile. He'll keep. I need to talk to him. After we get you, Dante." Dante looked at him. "I need to talk to him before he has time to compose himself," Kyle said. "Now." Dante looked at Price. Something passed between them. Price made a left turn. The man in the storeroom was zip-tied to a support column and bleeding from a cut above his left eyebrow that had been left untreated, which was either a practical oversight or a deliberate message. He was mid-40s, fit in the maintained way of a person whose fitness was professional rather than recreational, with a complexion that had seen a lot of weather and eyes that were doing the rapid inventory of a man assessing how badly wrong his evening had gone. Kyle came into the room first. Selena stayed in the corridor with Giacomo outside the door, which she hadn't objected to. Dante came in behind Kyle and stood near the wall. Kyle crouched in front of the man and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The man looked back. "You're not one of Crow's regulars," Kyle said. The man said nothing. "The breach configuration you used," Kyle said, "that's federal. That's military adjacent. That's not a judge's private contractor." Nothing. "Which means Crow hired outside his usual network," Kyle said. "Which means he was specifically worried that his usual network might have a leak." He paused. "Which means he knows his network might have a leak. Which means he's worried about someone." The man's eyes shifted 1 millimeter to the left and reset. An involuntary calibration, too small for anyone not specifically watching for it. Kyle said, "Who hired you?" "Nothing." "I'm not going to hurt you," Kyle said. "You're going to think that's a manipulation, but it isn't. I don't need information from you under duress because information under duress is unreliable, and I'm a person who relies on reliability." He paused. "What I can offer you instead is the following. You tell me who hired you, specifically by what chain, and I put you in a car heading north inside the next hour with enough cash to be somewhere else by morning. You don't tell me, and I hand you to the Chicago PD, where at least 3 of Crow's contacts will be informed of your presence within the hour, and you'll have a very different kind of night." The man's breathing shifted, subtle but present. "Crow's network is collapsing," Kyle said quietly. "The men who hired you are going to be looking for exposure points to eliminate. You're an exposure point. You understand that." A long silence. Then the man said, "The hire came through a firm called Meridian Security Group. Private contract. The client name on the paperwork was a shell. I know it was a shell. I do this work. I know what a shell looks like. But the contact who briefed me..." He stopped, looked at the floor. "His name isn't Crow. His name is Halford, Deputy Director of a Federal Oversight Committee. He's been managing Crow's exposure for 6 years." The room was completely quiet. Kyle looked at the man. "Halford," he said. "Michael Halford. He briefed me personally 3 days ago. He told me the primary target was a woman at the Moretti estate, and the objective was retrieval, not termination." The man's eyes came up. "I don't do termination contracts. I want that on record." "It's noted," Kyle said. He stood. "Retrieval meaning..." "The woman," the man said. "Alive. Crow wants her back." Kyle turned to Dante. Dante's expression had gone flat in the specific way it went flat when he was processing something he needed to manage his reaction to. "Get him out," Kyle said. "North, clean. What I said." Dante moved. Kyle walked out of the storeroom into the corridor. Selene was standing 10 feet away with Giacomo, and she read Kyle's face as he came through the door. Quickly, automatically, the way she read everything. And he watched her read it, and he didn't try to adjust his expression fast enough to hide whatever was on it. "He said retrieval," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She closed her eyes, just for a second, then opened them. "Kyle," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without it being required by the direct mechanics of a sentence. "What else?" "Not here," he said. "Get in the car, but..." The secondary location was a brownstone in the north side that Kyle kept under a corporate name and used 3 or 4 times a year for situations that required complete separation from the estate's operational footprint. It had 4 rooms an interior staircase, a kitchen that Marco had stocked the previous month without knowing why, and external cameras that fed to a monitor in the main room. They arrived at 11:40 at night. Celine sat at the kitchen table while Kyle stood, and Dante sat across from her with his laptop open, and Oscar, who had been brought separately, worked at the counter behind them on a secondary machine. "Halford," Kale said to Oscar. Oscar's fingers were already moving. "I have him, Michael Halford, Deputy Director of the Federal Oversight and Accountability Committee. Appointed 9 years ago. Prior to that, Assistant U.S. Attorney." Oscar scrolled. "He appears 4 times in the network diagram. I flagged him as peripheral 2 tiers removed from Crow. I was wrong about the tier." "He's not peripheral," Kyle said. "He's the insulation. He's what makes Crow untouchable from the federal side." Oscar nodded slowly. "If Halford is active in the cover operation, then every federal channel we've been considering as a possible delivery route for the evidence is compromised," Kyle said. Celine was looking at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface, not the cup-holding posture, not the thumb-pressing posture. Flat, open, which he was learning to read as the posture of a person who has run out of a specific kind of energy. "The storage unit," she said. "If Halford has been managing Crow's exposure for 6 years, he would have known about it," Oscar said, not unkindly, but precisely. "How long?" she said. "I can't say with certainty, but if Crow suspected you'd been documenting—" "He knew," she said. "He knew for a while." She looked up. "He let me keep building it. He let me think I had insurance." She paused. "And then when I left, when I signed the contract, he had Halford pull the unit because the insurance became a threat instead of a leash." The kitchen was very quiet. Kyle looked at her and understood, in the specific physical way you understand things that land in the chest rather than the head, that she was describing a surveillance operation that had been run on her own life for years, that the safety net she'd been quietly, carefully building in the dark had been known about and monitored and allowed to exist because its existence kept her manageable, kept her believing she had an exit, until the moment she used the exit, at which point it became evidence against her and was confiscated. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Oscar, the Mercer Street property, the server she described. I've been running it," Oscar said. "The property is registered to a holding company, Carrington Capital, LLC, which connects to a registered agent in Delaware whose address is a mailbox at a UPS store. Third shell. But—" Oscar turned the laptop screen so it faced the table. "The utility account, electric, gas, those are harder to fully anonymize because they require a physical service address. The utility account for Mercer Street traces back through a billing administrator to an account that was opened by a person named Gregory Vane. Vane is an attorney. He appears once in the network diagram. Crow's people," Dante said. "One of them," Oscar said. "But here's the thing. Vane died 14 months ago. Natural causes. Cardiac event. The account wasn't transferred or closed. It just kept running, which means someone is paying the bills automatically from an account that belongs to a dead man, which means either Crow forgot to clean it or he didn't think anyone would ever get this deep into the paper trail," Kale said. "Or that," Oscar said. Kale looked at the screen, then at Celine. "The server at Mercer Street," he said. "If it still exists, if it hasn't been moved." "It's been there for 20 years, Celine said. "He built the basement specifically for it. It's not something you relocate easily." "But he may have wiped it," Dante said. "He may have," Celine said. "Or he may not have gotten to it yet if he didn't think—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. "If he didn't think I'd told anyone about it." Kale looked at her. "Did you tell anyone?" he said. "No," she said. "Ever." She paused. "He doesn't know I told you." The kitchen held the information for a moment. "He took the storage unit because he knew about it," Kale said slowly. "He doesn't know about Mercer Street because you never told anyone about Mercer Street. You only knew about it by accident. He may not know that you know." Celine was very still. "If the server at Mercer Street still has what I think it has," she said, "it has everything, not the copies I made. His originals. 20 years of it." Her voice was level, but something underneath it was moving fast. He could hear it the way you hear current beneath still water. Names, amounts, dates, communication records. Everything he didn't think he needed to hide because he didn't think anyone could ever reach it. Oscar said quietly, "That would be enough." "That would be enough to burn the whole machine," Dante said. Crow, Halford, Halford, everyone in the network. "If we can get to it before he realizes we know it exists," Kyle said. Celine looked at him. "I know the building. I know the basement layout. I know where the server is and how it's accessed." "You're not going," Kyle said. "I'm the only one who can get through the basement without triggering the secondary alarm. He modified the system 6 years ago. It has a biometric component. My handprint is still registered. He never removed it because he never thought I'd be in a position to use it." Kyle looked at her for a long moment. "It's a trap," Dante said. "It might be," Selene said. "It also might be the only copy of evidence that still exists, and the only thing capable of stopping a federal judge and a deputy director from dismantling whatever we try to build against them." She paused. "I'm willing to take the risk." "I'm not willing for you to take it," Kyle said. "That's not your decision. In this house it is." She looked at him with an expression that was neither angry nor submissive, but something else entirely. The expression of a person who has had the terms of their existence dictated by other people for years and has reached, very quietly, the end of their tolerance for it, even when the person doing the dictating means well. "Kale," she said, "I have spent 12 years building toward a single moment where I could destroy him. He took my copies. He has Halford. He has police commanders and judges and federal protection. I am 26 years old and I have nothing left except the one thing I know that he doesn't know I know." She held his gaze. "I'm going." Dante looked at Kyle. Kale looked at Celine. The kitchen light hummed overhead. "Not alone," he said. "Bama." They went at 2 in the morning, when the city's overnight metabolism reached its lowest point, and the streets had the specific hollow quality of a place that has sent most of its people to sleep and not yet called them back. Price drove. Kyle and Celine were in the back. Dante was in a secondary vehicle 2 blocks behind as backup, with Giacomo and 2 others. The Mercer Street address was a narrow 3-story building in a commercial zone that had been gradually abandoned over the previous decade. Auto body shops, a closed printing business, a dry cleaner that still showed lights after hours, but had no clear operating hours posted. The kind of block that sustained itself on transactions that didn't need signage. Crow's building looked like a private record storage facility, which was exactly what it was designed to look like. Dark windows on all 3 floors. A single entry point at street level with a card reader and camera. A secondary entrance around the back through an alley wide enough for 1 vehicle. Price parked 2 streets over. Kyle looked at the building through the passenger window. "Camera at the front entrance," he said. "We go around the back." "The alley camera is motion activated, but it runs on a 5-second delay before recording initiates," Celine said. She'd been quiet for most of the drive, but she'd been looking at the route, cataloging, and now she was clear and specific. "The back entrance has a mechanical lock and a card reader. The card reader is tied to Crow's system. The mechanical lock?" She paused. "I know the combination. He used the same combination on everything for 15 years. I don't know if he changed it." "We prepare for either," Kale said. They went out of the vehicle. The alley was wet and smelled of garbage and old asphalt, and the rain had slowed to a fine mist that sat on surfaces without quite falling, and they moved through it quickly with Kyle ahead and Celine close behind and Price covering the alley entrance. The back door had the mechanical lock. Celine crouched in front of it. Her hands were steady. He watched them specifically because he wanted to know, not as an assessment of her reliability, but because he'd watched her hands do many things in the last 24 hours, and they told him more about her internal state than her face did. Steady, 4-digit combination. She tried it once. The lock didn't open. She sat back on her heels for a moment. "He changed it," Kyle said quietly. "Wait," she said. She tried a second sequence. Nothing. Then a third, and something in her face changed fractionally, some small private recognition. And she tried a 4th sequence, and the lock opened. She stood. "His brother's birthday," she said quietly. "He always kept a backup." They went inside. Ahak. The basement was reached through a door at the rear of the ground floor, behind a row of filing cabinets that were real and legitimately used. which was the kind of detail that told Kyle this building had been set up by someone who understood that the best concealment is functional camouflage. The basement staircase was narrow and concrete, and the air at the bottom was cool and carried the specific dry metallic smell of running server equipment. Celine's handprint opened the secondary door. The server room was small, 10 feet by 12, with racks of equipment that were not state-of-the-art but were maintained, humming steadily, indicator lights blinking in the dark in patterns that suggested active operation. A monitor on a wall mount, a workstation chair. And on the central rack, a server unit with a label in small black type, Archive. Do not modify. Celine crossed to it immediately. Kale stood at the door, watching the room and the staircase simultaneously, his hand on his weapon. Celine's fingers moved over the workstation keyboard, waking the monitor, navigating through a system that she had clearly studied and mapped from memory with the completeness of someone who has visited a location in their head so many times that the physical version is almost familiar. "It's all here," she said. Her voice was very quiet, almost nothing. "He didn't wipe it." "How long to copy it?" Kyle said. "I need a drive." "Oscar." Kale reached into his jacket and produced the drive Oscar had given him before they left the brownstone. Celine took it without looking, found the port, inserted it. The progress bar on the monitor began moving. They stood in the server room while the copy ran, Kyle at the door, Celine at the workstation, the building quiet around them with the specific quality of a quiet that isn't safe but is temporarily empty. And Kyle was watching the staircase and the walls and the door and tracking every sound in the building above them when his phone buzzed silently in his pocket. Dante. Text message. He read it. Then he read it again. The text said, "Sorrel just called. Federal warrants issued 20 minutes ago. 3 of them. Kyle Moretti, estate and known properties, and 1 for a Celine Vale Moretti. Halford moved. Someone talked." Kale stood in the doorway of the server room and looked at the text and felt the specific cold clarity of a man watching an architecture he's been building get dismantled from a direction he didn't account for. Federal warrants. Halford moving through legitimate channels, using his committee access to manufacture a legal framework that, once in place, would give Crow's network the ability to sweep everything. The estate, the brownstone, Oscar's files, everything they'd gathered, and a warrant for Celine. He looked up from the phone. Celine was watching the progress bar. 63%, 70. He looked at the text again. Someone talked, not from the outside, from inside. Someone in the chain between Kyle's people and the information about their movements tonight had fed something to Halford's network. The brownstone address, the timeline, the Mercer Street operation. Not enough to stop them yet, but enough to accelerate the warrant process. Enough to give Halford the legal architecture to move in the morning with documented justification. Kyle thought about who knew the brownstone address. He thought about the chain of communication from the estate to the secondary location. He thought about Dante, Oscar, Price, Giacomo, Marco, Sorrel, who had called to warn him about the surveillance order that morning, who had called just now to warn him about the warrants, who had been on his payroll for 6 years and had never before been in a position to warn him about 2 things in a single 24-hour window. Kyle pressed his palm flat against the doorframe and thought about it with the cold, systematic precision he applied to things he didn't want to be true. Sorrel hadn't been warning him this morning. Sorrel had been confirming his location. The surveillance order on the estate, Kyle had assumed it came through Crow's network independently. But if Sorrel had fed Kyle's morning movements to Halford's people, the surveillance wasn't placed because Crow found out Kyle was looking. The surveillance was placed because Sorrel told them Kyle was looking, which meant the breach at the estate tonight hadn't been reactive. It had been coordinated, and the call just now, warning him about the warrants, was Sorrel running the same play again, not protecting Kyle, establishing his location, confirming he was at a secondary address and not the estate, giving Halford's people time to prepare the morning sweep. Kale's jaw tightened. 6 years. He pressed a second text to Dante. Don't respond to Sorrel. Don't tell him where we are. Find him and hold him. Now. Dante's response came back in 4 seconds. Already moving. The progress bar on the monitor hit 91%. Celine said, "Almost." Kyle looked at her back, at the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, the particular quality of her posture as she stood in front of the server that had been the one remaining piece of real ammunition in a fight that had been stripped of almost everything else. He thought about what he was going to have to tell her. Not about the warrants. She'd handle the warrants. But about what the warrants meant. That Halford had moved fast enough to get federal paperwork in motion within hours of the breach, which meant the legal framework had been prepared in advance, which meant this wasn't reactive either. Someone had prepared the warrant application before tonight, before the breach, possibly before the wedding, which meant that from the moment Celine signed the contract and moved into the Moretti estate, someone in the network had been building the legal case to take her back out of it. The warrant wasn't a response to tonight. It was the plan. The storage unit emptied, the breach at the estate, the warrants, all of it sequenced, all of it moving on a timeline that assumed Kyle would eventually find out about Crow and respond, and had prepared a legal mechanism to neutralize that response before it could reach any channel that mattered. They hadn't underestimated Kyle. They'd calculated him, predicted his moves, built a counter for each one, and the only thing they hadn't predicted, the only variable outside the model, was the server in this basement, because Celine had never told anyone, and so it had never entered the calculation. The progress bar hit 100%. The drive ejected automatically. Celine pulled it out and turned. She looked at his face. The room was completely quiet. "What happened?" she said. He told her. He watched her take it in, the warrants, the leak, Sorrel, the timeline, and he watched her face do something he hadn't seen it do yet. Not shut down, not go blank. The opposite. Something opened in it, briefly, like a load-bearing wall giving way. Not a collapse, but a structural shift. The face of someone absorbing a blow that landed in the place they'd been most carefully protecting. "They planned it from the beginning," she said. "Yes. The contract. They knew about the contract. Halford has federal access. He would have flagged it. They let me come here," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "They let me think I was—" She stopped. Kyle said nothing. "I traded one trap for another," she said. "No," Kyle said. "That's what happened." "No," Kyle said again, more firmly. "You got the drive. They didn't plan for the drive. Whatever is on that server, they didn't know you knew about it. That's the only reason we're still ahead." She looked at the drive in her hand. Then she looked at him with an expression that had passed through several stages in the last 30 seconds and arrived somewhere he hadn't seen on her before. Not the controlled blankness, not the suspended judgment, something sharper and colder and more committed than either. "Then we need to use it before morning," she said. "Yes," Kale said. "How?" Kale looked at the drive, looked at her. "The gala," he said. "Blackthorn Hotel. It's not next week anymore." He held her gaze. "It's tomorrow night." Celine looked at him. The server room hummed around them, and the mist fell on the city above. And somewhere across town, a federal warrant with her name on it was sitting in a document queue waiting for morning, and the man who had spent 20 years building a machine around her life was 3 moves ahead of everyone she had. The drive sat on the kitchen table of the brownstone at 3 in the morning, and everyone in the room looked at it the way you look at something that is simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous object you have ever been in proximity to. Oscar picked it up first. He turned it over once in his fingers, then plugged it into his laptop without ceremony because Oscar's relationship with dangerous information was professional rather than emotional, and he'd learned years ago that hesitation before a hard drive accomplished nothing. The room waited. 60 seconds. 90. Then Oscar said, "It's real." And his voice had the specific flatness of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping might be wrong about the scale of. This is 22 years. Everything. Transaction records, communication logs, video files, names cross-referenced against dates and payments. He kept it organized. Oscar looked up. He kept it organized like an accountant, like he was proud of it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Celine was standing against the far wall with her arms crossed and her eyes on the window. She hadn't sat down since they came back from Mercer Street. She was running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore, past adrenaline, into the harder territory on the other side of it where the body stops feeling sharp and starts feeling made of concrete. How long to prepare a package, Kyle said. Something that goes to multiple recipients simultaneously. Something that can't be intercepted or suppressed at a single point. If I build a distribution architecture tonight, Oscar said, I can have it ready to deploy on a trigger. 15 recipients minimum. Investigative journalists, federal contacts outside Halford's committee, 2 foreign press outlets. Once it goes to all of them at once. No one suppresses 15 destinations simultaneously. Do it, Kyle said. But we don't send it yet. Dante looked at him. Why not? Because the warrants are in motion, Kyle said. If we send the package tonight, Halford has enough political capital to begin a suppression campaign before the press can develop the story. He needs a news cycle to work with. He needs the story to arrive in a context where Crow and Halford are already publicly associated with an incident that's been witnessed. He paused. The gala gives us that context. Dante said, the gala is tomorrow night. Yes, we have federal warrants being executed in the morning. Which is why we're not here in the morning, Kyle said. Dante looked at the table, looked at Kyle. You're going to walk into a room full of people who want to arrest her, and people who want to kill her, and you're going to what? Make a scene large enough for cameras to catch and then release the package. Yes, Kyle said. The room was quiet. Selene turned from the window. I'll go, she said. Dante said, with respect. I already decided, she said. Her voice had no performance in it. Just wait. I'm going. They moved twice before dawn. First to a location Dante kept entirely off Kyle's operational books, a property in his own name, a cousin's address, 3 rooms above a restaurant that wouldn't open until noon. Then at 6 in the morning, when the warrant execution teams would be staging at the brownstone in the estate, Kyle moved them again to a hotel on the near north side under a name Oscar had prepared the previous week for an unrelated operation and which had never touched any of their known aliases. 2 rooms, 4th floor. Kale took the room with the street view and put Selene in the interior room with no external windows, which she didn't argue with. He didn't sleep. He sat at the small desk with his phone and worked through the logistics of the evening in increments. The Blackthorn Hotel layout, the gala guest list Oscar had pulled from the event's public ticketing record, the positions of Crow's known associates in the room, the location of every camera rig the hotel's events team had contracted for the evening. At 7:40, Dante texted, warrants executed at Estate and Brownstone. Both empty. Sorrel is secured. He's talking. Kale replied, what's he saying? The response took 4 minutes. He's been feeding location data to Halford's people for 8 months. Started before the wedding. Crow's network identified you as a threat when the contract was offered. They wanted to know your movements. Sorrel says he didn't know about the trafficking operation. He thought he was managing a political exposure situation for a federal judge. He says that like it makes a difference. Kale read it twice. 8 months. They'd been inside his operations for 8 months, mapping his patterns, anticipating his responses, building the legal framework around a threat they'd identified before the wedding invitations were printed. He set the phone down. He thought about Luca. He thought about Luca because this was the kind of moment Luca would have walked into the room for, the moment after the architecture of a plan has been stripped down to its last viable component, when the only move left is the most exposed one. When a person who operates on patience and precision has to make a decision based on something other than patience and precision. Luca would have said, sometimes the only way through is straight through. Kale had always thought that was reckless. He was beginning to reconsider. He picked up the phone and called Oscar. The distribution package, he said. Have it ready to deploy at 9:45 tonight, on my signal only. If you don't hear from me by 10:15, you deploy regardless. Understood, Oscar said. Then, carefully, Kyle, if it deploys without your signal, then it deploys, Kyle said. That's the point. He ended the call. At 8:30, he knocked on the interior room door. Selene opened it after a moment. She'd slept. A few hours at least. He could see it in the slight softening around her eyes, the hair not quite as controlled as she usually kept it. And she was holding a cup of coffee from the room's machine that was probably terrible, and she was drinking it anyway. She looked at him. He told her the timeline, the 9:45 trigger, the 10:15 hard deployment, what he needed from her at the gala and what he needed her to avoid, and the one specific thing he needed her to be prepared for. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You need him to approach me." "Yes." "You need him to say something that the cameras pick up, or do something," Kyle said. "Either works, but it has to be documented. It has to be the image that runs with the story when the package drops." She looked at her coffee. "He'll approach me," she said. "He won't be able to help it. It's not restraint he has. It's control. Those are different things. In a room full of people he thinks are on his side, he'll approach me to demonstrate that he's not afraid of me. That's how he works." She paused. "He'll say something quiet, something only I can hear." "Then I need to be close enough to hear it too," Kyle said. She looked at him. "How close?" she said. "Arm's length," he said. Something moved across her face, complex and fast and not fully resolved. "Okay," she said. The Blackthorn Hotel rose 20 stories above Michigan Avenue in the specific architectural language of a building that wanted to look timeless and had enough money behind it to mostly succeed. Its grand ballroom occupied the entire third floor, and on gala evenings it became a pressurized environment of money performing itself. Crystal and candlelight, an orchestrated conversation, and the careful management of proximity between people who needed each other and didn't fully trust each other and were skilled enough to make that arrangement look civilized. They arrived at 8:15. Kyle wore black. No tie, as always. He'd made one concession to the evening's requirements. He'd left the visible sidearm at the car and moved to a smaller weapon at the back of his belt, covered by the jacket, accessible in under a second but invisible to the room's security scan. If security was being managed the way he expected it to be managed, given who was on the guest list. Celine wore black velvet. He registered it in the way you register something that isn't the point, but is present anyway. The way the dress was cut, the way it held to her shoulders, the way her hair was up and diamonds were at her throat and ears. Not performing beauty, performing armor. She'd constructed an appearance that was entirely appropriate to the room and entirely impenetrable in its elegance, and he understood it as the same thing she'd done at the wedding, not dressing for the occasion but dressing against it, building something external that gave nothing away. She was steady walking in. He could feel it rather than see it. The quality of her gait beside him, controlled without being rigid, the breathing timed and deliberate. "You've done this before," he said quietly as they entered the ballroom. "Walked into rooms I didn't want to be in," she said. "Yes." "Then you know the drill. Smile at the right intervals. Make eye contact, but not too long. Let the room decide you belong here before anyone decides to question it," she said. "Yes." He let the corner of his mouth move slightly. "Exactly that." The room was 300 people and rising, the kind of crowd that filled space without filling it, islands of conversation, servers moving between with champagne, a string quartet in the far corner producing sound that was designed to suggest culture without demanding attention. Kyle moved them through the near edge of the room, keeping the wall to his left, tracking positions. Dante was already inside, in a gray suit, positioned near the bar with a glass he wasn't drinking. Giacomo was by the eastern entrance. Two others at points Kyle had assigned from the floor plan that morning. At 8:42, Kyle located Vernon Crow. He was near the center of the room, holding court in the way powerful men hold court. Slightly elevated affect, the body positioned to receive rather than seek, other people orienting toward him in the small unconscious ways that indicate a gravitational center. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man whose face had been arranged by decades of professional performance into something that read as distinguished rather than predatory unless you were looking for it. Kyle was looking for it. He could see it. The eyes moved differently than the face. The face was performing warmth and collegial ease. The eyes were doing inventory. Crow hadn't seen them yet. Kyle steered them toward the opposite end of the room and accepted 2 glasses of champagne from a passing server and handed one to Celine. She took it with both hands. "He's here," she said. Not a question. "Near center, don't look yet." She didn't look. She brought the glass up and took a small sip and looked at the string quartet instead, and her face was completely composed. How long? She said. He'll find you within 20 minutes, Kyle said. He'll have seen us come in. She nodded once. 17 minutes later, Vernon Crow began moving across the room. Kyle tracked it in his peripheral vision. The way Crow disengaged from his cluster without making it look like disengagement. The way he moved with the deliberate casualness of a man who is going somewhere specific while appearing to go nowhere in particular. He had two men a few steps behind him who were wearing suits that didn't fit their shoulders correctly. Celine felt it before she saw it. Kyle saw her feel it, the slight change in her breathing, the way her grip on the champagne glass adjusted, the set of her jaw moving a fraction. He's coming, she said. I know, Kyle said. He stepped slightly closer to her, closing the angle, positioning himself so his body was between Crow's approach vector and Celine's left side. Whatever he says, don't move away. Stay exactly where you are. I know, she said. Vernon Crow arrived. He stopped 4 feet away, and the smile that came onto his face was the most controlled expression Kyle had ever seen on a human being. Not because it was unreadable, but because it was perfectly calibrated. The smile of a man who has had decades of practice, producing an expression that says, I am delighted to see you to a room full of observers, while saying something entirely different to the person it's aimed at. Celine, he said. The voice was warm, senatorial, projected just enough to carry to the nearest people without being loud. I didn't know you'd be attending tonight. Celine looked at him. Kale watched her look at him, and he watched what it cost her, and he watched her pay it without flinching. Vernon, she said, level, correct. The voice of a woman at a social function exchanging pleasantries. Crow's eyes moved to Kyle. The smile modulated, not disappearing but adjusting, the warmth dialing back to something more accessorial. Kyle Moretti, Crow said. You have a remarkable wife. Yes, Kyle said. I do. A beat. Crow looked back at Celine, the eyes doing their inventory behind the face. You look well, he said. Then, lower, dropping the volume just enough to exclude the nearest conversation cluster, not enough to be visibly conspiratorial. You should come see me. We have things to discuss. Celine said nothing. Crow's smile stayed exactly in place. There are matters outstanding between us, he said, quieter still, and the specific quality of his quiet was the quality of a man reminding someone of a debt. A leash being gently pulled. I think you understand what I mean. Kale said, I think she understands perfectly. Crow looked at him, and something happened in Crow's eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration, the kind that occurs when a person realizes the terrain has shifted in a way they didn't fully account for. And for one moment, the face and the eyes were doing the same thing. Then Crow said pleasantly, This is a private conversation. There are no private conversations in this room, Kyle said. He said it at normal volume. Normal conversational register. He was very calm. The cameras on the east wall and the two at the entrance and the one directly above us that the hotel's events team positioned for the charity segment of the evening have been running since 8 o'clock. I made sure of it. Crow's jaw moved, just slightly. You should walk away, Crow said. The warmth was gone from the voice now. What remained was older and colder and much more truthful. No, Kyle said. The two men behind Crow shifted. Kyle heard Dante moving from the bar, the specific quality of footsteps changing direction and purpose, and Giacomo repositioning at the eastern entrance, and the room's ambient noise continued around them like weather that hadn't noticed the pressure drop yet. Crow looked at Celine. Whatever he's told you, he started. She told me, Kyle said. She told me about Mercer Street. She told me about the server. She told me about 22 years of records that are currently in a format that is being distributed to 15 journalists and federal investigators as we stand here. The color left Vernon Crow's face, not dramatically, not the way it happens in performance, the way it happens in reality, a slow cellular withdrawal, the body processing a threat that the mind hasn't caught up to yet, blood rerouting to the places that might need it. You're lying, Crow said. Kale looked at him. At 9:45 tonight, he said, you'll know I'm not. And then Crow moved. Not toward Kyle, toward Celine. He reached for her arm. Not violently, not yet, but with the specific grip of a man who has spent years using physical contact as a demonstration of ownership. And Kael's hand came up and closed around Crow's wrist before the contact completed, and the room's nearest cluster of people turned, and 2 cameras on the east wall were pointed directly at them, and the string quartet continued playing something that had nothing to do with any of this. Crow looked down at Kael's hand on his wrist. Then he looked up. "You have no idea," Crow said quietly, "what you've just done to yourself." "I have a very specific idea," Kael said. He released Crow's wrist and stepped back deliberately, putting himself between Crow and Celine, and he was aware of the room around them, the heads turning, the conversations pausing, the specific quality of a crowd that has sensed a disruption and hasn't yet decided how to respond to it. Crow's 2 men moved. The first one came fast from the left, not drawing a weapon, not yet, moving to physically remove the obstruction, which was the wrong decision for the right room because it was visible. It was exactly the kind of visible that cameras document and witnesses remember. And Kael moved to meet him with the efficiency of a person who has spent decades understanding that the most important variable in a physical encounter is the first 3 seconds. He hit the man once, short and precise, at the hinge of the jaw. The man's legs went and he went with them, catching himself on a nearby table and taking a champagne glass down with a crash that cut through the string quartet like a stone through glass. The room went to full attention. The second man had his hand inside his jacket. "Don't," Dante said from directly behind him, close enough that the word was in the man's ear. The hand stopped. People were moving back. Someone was saying something about calling security. 2 cameras were oriented directly at the space where Kael and Crow and Celine stood in a triangle of approximately 5 feet, and the overhead camera above them was running, and the ballroom's event photographer who had been working the far side of the room had turned and raised his camera, because human beings with cameras always turn toward disruption. Vernon Crow stood in the center of it with his face finally, for the first time, doing the same thing as his eyes. He looked at Celine. She was looking back at him. She was standing with her shoulders back and her chin level and the champagne glass still in both hands. She hadn't dropped it, hadn't stepped back, hadn't moved at all. And she was looking at the man who had defined the shape of her life for 12 years with an expression that had passed entirely through fear and come out the other side of it into something that didn't have a comfortable name but was made of 12 years of surviving him. Crow said to her, low and vicious, the last performance gone, "You have nothing. You were nothing before me and you're—" "She belongs to nobody," Kael said. He said it at full volume, in the voice he used when he needed a room to hear something and remember it, clear and absolute, and carrying across the sudden quiet of 300 people who had stopped performing civility, especially not monsters. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. Then Vernon Crow's hand came up with the speed of a man who has nothing left to lose. And Kael saw the movement and stepped into it rather than back from it because stepping back was how people got shot. And the weapon came out from Crow's jacket and the room erupted, screaming, tables overturned, the stampede geometry of a crowd finding exits. And Kael had both hands on Crow's gun hand before the muzzle fully cleared the fabric. They went into the nearest table together, destroying it completely, and the floor came up, and Kael was on top of Crow with the gun between them, and his left hand locked around Crow's wrist and his right, driving Crow's elbow at an angle that made continued grip on the weapon a structural impossibility. Crow was strong, older than Kael and in the preserved fitness of a man who works at staying dangerous, and he fought with the specific intensity of a man fighting for something beyond the immediate physical outcome, fighting for the story, for the outcome, for 22 years of invested architecture. He drove a knee up into Kael's side and connected. The pain was immediate and white, and Kael registered it the way he registered all pain, as information rather than experience, a signal carrying data about damage rather than something that required a response beyond adjusted positioning. He took the impact and didn't give ground, bore down on the wrist until he felt the point at which human physiology required the fingers to open and the gun came loose and slid across the ballroom floor. Crow went for Kael's throat. His fingers found the scar at the jawline and dug in. Kael pulled back, broke the grip, and hit Crow once with everything. The weight behind it, the precision behind it, and 12 years of what had been done in the dark behind it, because that was what was in the room and that was what was in the punch, and Crow's head hit the ballroom floor and he stopped moving. Kael stayed above him for a moment, breathing hard. His side was a continuous white signal. His knuckles were split. There was blood from somewhere. His or Crow's, he couldn't locate the source in the immediate inventory. He looked up. Celine was 4 feet away. She hadn't run. The room was mostly cleared, people pressing against the walls and the exits, hotel security arriving at the entrances with the belated urgency of people whose training hadn't prepared them for this specific configuration of events. Dante was to the left with both of Crow's men secured. Giacomo was at the door managing the room's perimeter, and Celine was standing 4 feet away with both hands still on the champagne glass. She had not let go of it through any of it, and she was looking at Kael. He got to his feet. Pain moved through his side in a wave, and he breathed through it and stood straight. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time, 9:41. He pressed the text to Oscar, "Send it." Then he looked up and across the ballroom floor toward the entrance, where 2 men in federal jackets had just come through the doors with their credentials out, which meant the warrants were being executed in real time, which meant Halford had been monitoring the situation and had called in the federal team when the gala went sideways, which meant the next 4 minutes were the most critical of the evening. Dante appeared at his shoulder. "Federal," he said quietly. "I see them. Kael, the warrant is for both of you." "I know." The 2 federal agents were moving toward them through the thinned crowd, and behind them 2 more came through the eastern entrance, and Kael watched them come and calculated the distance and the time and the difference between 9:41 and 9:45 and held his ground. Celine moved to stand beside him. He looked at her. She looked at the approaching agents. "The package goes at 9:45, he said. 4 minutes, she said. "Yes." "They'll have us in custody in 4 minutes." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Then this is where we find out if it worked," she said. The agents were 20 feet away. Kael stood without moving, breathing through the pain in his side, watching the distance close, and somewhere across the city, Oscar's distribution architecture was 47 seconds from firing outward into 15 inboxes simultaneously, and somewhere in the cloud, the evidence from a server in a basement on Mercer Street was traveling toward every person with the reach and the will to do something with 22 years of documented truth. The lead federal agent stopped 6 feet away and showed his credential. "Kael Moretti," the agent said, You're under arrest." Kael looked at him. "Give it 4 minutes," he said. The agent said, "Sir?" 4 minutes, Kael said, "and you're going to want to make a different phone call." The agent looked at him, at Celine, at the unconscious form of Vernon Crow on the ballroom floor, at Dante and Giacomo holding 2 men against the far wall, at the overturned tables and the broken glass, and the 300 witnesses pressing against the edges of the room with their phones out. He said, "Hands where I can see them." Kael raised his hands. Celine raised hers. And across the city, at 9:45 and 12 seconds, Oscar's architecture fired, and 22 years of Vernon Crow's careful records began arriving in the inboxes of people who knew what to do with them. And the machine that had been running in the dark for 2 decades, the handcuffs were standard federal issue. Hard plastic zip ties, not metal, which meant they'd moved fast and light, and they bit into Kael's wrists at the precise point where the skin was already abraded from the struggle on the ballroom floor. He registered the discomfort with the same detached accounting he applied to all physical information and filed it under manageable and turned his attention to the room. They were in a service corridor behind the ballroom. Him and Celine side by side against a concrete wall, 2 federal agents in front of them, 1 more at the door that led back into the venue. The sound of the ballroom came through muffled and rearranged. The panic of before had settled into the specific controlled chaos of aftermath. The sounds of people being sorted and interviewed and made to wait in orderly configurations by people with credentials. Vernon Crow was somewhere in the building. Kael had watched them load him onto a gurney before the agent steered him and Celine out of the ballroom, and Crow had been conscious but not coherent, which was exactly the correct amount of conscious for a man in his position to be. Celine was to his left. Her wrists were bound in front of her, and she was standing with her back straight against the wall, looking at the middle distance, doing the thing she did when she needed to hold herself together through an experience that required enduring rather than acting. The champagne glass was gone. She'd still been holding it when the agents approached, and she'd set it down on an overturned table with careful precision, like punctuating a sentence, before she raised her hands. Kael looked at the nearest agent. "Check your phone," Kael said. The agent looked at him. "I'm not asking for a favor," Kael said. I'm telling you that in the last 4 minutes, 15 recipients received a data package from a server at a property on Mercer Street in this city. That package contains 22 years of documented evidence connecting Vernon Crow to a trafficking operation that implicates multiple federal officials, including a deputy director of your oversight committee. He paused. Check your phone. Someone in your chain of command is already calling. The agent held his gaze for a moment, then he looked at his partner. His partner had her phone out. She was reading something on the screen with the expression of a person whose evening has just been restructured from the ground up. She looked up. Something passed between her and her partner that was communicative without being verbal. The agent looked back at Kyle. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The corridor was quiet for approximately 15 seconds. Then the agent said, "Don't move," to both of them, and stepped away to take the call. Celine turned her head and looked at Kyle. He looked back at her. 9:46, he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, the territory adjacent to one. "You cut it close," she said. "I prefer efficiency," he said. She looked at the wall across from them. Her hands were loose in the zip ties, not pulling against them, just present. "Crow," she said. "Alive," KL said, "which is what we need him." "You could have—" "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Kale looked at the ceiling of the service corridor. Exposed pipes, utilitarian concrete, the unglamorous infrastructure of a building that spent all its money on the parts people saw. "Because dead men don't testify," he said, "and I want him to testify. In a room with cameras and a public record. I want every man in his network to watch him answer for it in front of people who are writing it down." He paused. For a man who spent 20 years building a public identity as an instrument of the law is a worse punishment than anything else. Celine was quiet. "Luca would have agreed with that," Kyle said. "He hadn't planned to say it. It came out of whatever place things come from when the adrenaline has burned down enough that the things you normally keep sealed start moving toward the surface." Celine looked at him. "Your brother," she said. "Yes." She looked back at the wall. "Tell me about him sometime." "Yes," KL said, and meant it. The agent came back. He stood in front of them, and the expression on his face had changed. Not dramatically, not apologetically, but in the specific way of a man who has received information that alters the operational context of his evening and is recalibrating the implications in real time. "The warrant," the agent said carefully, "is under review." Kale said nothing. "There's going to be a process," the agent said. "Tonight." "There usually is," Kale said. The agent looked at Celine. Something in his face was doing something other than professional management. He was looking at her the way a person looks at someone after they've been given partial information about what that person has survived. Not quite pity. Something less comfortable than pity. Something that required more from the person feeling it. He bent down and cut the zip tie on her wrists first. The process the agent had referred to took 4 hours. They were taken to a federal field office rather than a precinct, a choice that indicated someone in the chain of command had already understood the scope of what the data package contained and made a decision about jurisdiction. The field office was on the 14th floor of a building that smelled of recycled air and carpet cleaner and had the specific late-night quality of a workplace running on emergency metabolism. People moving through corridors with the focused urgency of a situation unfolding faster than normal protocols could manage. Kale was put in one room, Celine in another. He sat at a table across from a woman named Agent Carreras, who had the compact, deliberate quality of someone who had been working organized crime cases for long enough to have stopped being surprised by the size of what people were capable of building in the dark. She had the data package on her laptop. She had questions that were specific, sequential, and entirely free of the kind of procedural performance that less experienced agents use to establish authority. He answered everything, not because he had to, because he'd made a calculation 3 days ago in the dining room of his estate with a cold cup of coffee and a sheet of paper with one name on it, and the calculation had required him to decide which version of the next year of his life he was willing to build. He'd spent the last week executing that decision, and now he was sitting in a federal interview room at 2 a.m, and the decision was still the right one. And that meant being in this room and answering Agent Carreras' questions completely was part of the architecture. He told her about Sorrel, About the leak, the 8 months of location data being fed to Halford's network, the breach at the estate. He told her about Mercer Street and how they got there and what they found. He told her about the warrant application and the timeline and the evidence that Halford had prepared a legal framework for Celine's retrieval before the wedding. Carreras typed and listened and occasionally asked him to slow down or clarify a specific point and didn't react visibly to any of it, which told him she'd been reading the data package in parallel and was cross-referencing as he spoke. At one point she said, "The evidence from the Mercer Street server, the original documentation, you're prepared to authenticate your access and the chain of custody." "Yes," Kyle said. "And your wife. She'll testify to everything," Kyle said, "on her own terms, through her own legal representation, with full victims advocate support. That's non-negotiable." Carreras looked at him over her laptop. "You're in a position to be negotiating," she said. "I'm in a position to be cooperating," he said, "which is different and which you need, and which I'm offering completely. But how this goes for her, what she's asked to do and how she's protected while she does it, that's a condition." A pause. "All right," Carreras said, and went back to typing. They let him out of the interview room at 4:20 in the morning. Celine was in the corridor outside. She was sitting on a bench against the wall with a paper cup of water in both hands, always, and she was alone. The agents who had been with her apparently having found other things to do in the last few minutes. She looked up when he came through the door. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him for a moment, the cut knuckles, the jacket missing a button, the way he was holding his left side slightly differently than usual, and said, "Your ribs." "Probably one," he said. "Maybe two." "You should—" "I know," he said. "Later." She stood. They were close in the corridor, closer than they'd been voluntarily, and she was looking at his face with the direct attention she gave things when she'd decided to look at them honestly rather than strategically. "They have Halford," she said. "An agent told me 20 minutes ago. He was taken from his residence. He's here somewhere in this building." "Good," Kyle said. "Crow is in federal custody at a hospital. His lawyers are already there, but the case agent told me—" She paused. "She said the evidence from the server is enough. She said it more than once, like she wanted me to hear it." She looked at the cup in her hands. "I don't know what that means yet. Enough. I've been told things were enough before." "This is different," Kyle said. "You keep saying things like that." "Because they keep being true." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I'm good at reading structures," he said. "Political, legal, operational. I've spent 30 years understanding which ones hold and which ones fall when you find the right pressure point. That network held because Halford insulated it from federal examination. Halford is in this building. The insulation is gone. The structure falls." She was quiet. "It falls," he said again. Quieter. "I promise you." She held his gaze for a long moment. The corridor was empty around them, the field office doing its 4 in the morning business in other rooms, and the fluorescent light above them was the unflattering honest light of a place that wasn't built for anything except function. And in that light, Celine Vale looked exhausted in a way that went past the physical. The exhaustion of a person who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has just been told, by a source they're deciding whether to trust, that they might be able to set it down. She looked at the cup in her hands. Then she set it on the bench behind her, and when she straightened, she didn't cross her arms, didn't find another thing to hold. She let her hands hang at her sides, open, and it was a small thing, but in the context of everything he'd learned to read about her, it was not a small thing at all. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, the weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about the process of dismantling 22 years of embedded corruption was clean, because corruption of that scale doesn't come apart in a single motion. It comes apart in layers, each layer revealing the one beneath it, and each revelation requiring a new set of decisions about evidence and testimony and legal strategy and which walls to push and which to let the process handle. Cale spent those weeks doing something he hadn't done in 30 years of running the Moretti operations, cooperating with federal investigators. Fully. It wasn't natural. It required a specific daily act of will to walk into rooms with people whose institutional purpose was opposed to his and give them what they needed without the calculation of what he was giving away. And there were mornings when he sat at a desk in a temporary office and felt the foreign weight of operating without the usual architecture of self-protection. He did it anyway, because the calculation he'd made in that dining room on the morning after his wedding required it, and Kyle Moretti did not make calculations he was unwilling to follow through on. 3 of Crow's network collapsed in the first week. A police commander named Reyes, who had been routing case information to Crow's people for 9 years, a city council member who had provided cover for 2 property acquisitions connected to the trafficking operation, and a federal prosecutor who had suppressed 2 prior investigations into Crow's activities in exchange for lateral career protection. They were arrested on a Tuesday morning in a coordinated action that Carreras' team had prepared with the specific quiet competence of people who had been waiting for the evidentiary foundation for longer than they'd say on the record. Michael Halford was indicted on the 3rd day. The indictment listed 14 counts: obstruction, abuse of federal authority, conspiracy, and 4 specific instances of directly facilitating the suppression of evidence in cases connected to Crow's operation. It was released publicly on a Thursday afternoon, and by Thursday evening, every major outlet in the country was running the story alongside the data package summary that Oscar's distribution had put in journalists' hands 6 days earlier. Cale watched it from the kitchen of a property he'd moved into temporarily. The estate was still processing the legal complications from the breach and the warrant execution, and he'd decided without particular anguish that the estate was probably not the right place going forward anyway, that a different kind of building suited a different kind of operation, and that he'd spent long enough in rooms built for the previous version of his life. Celine watched the coverage from across the kitchen. She watched it with both hands around a coffee cup. The posture hadn't changed, might never fully change. Some habits are too deep to dissolve in a few weeks. But the quality of her stillness was different now, not the stillness of a person maintaining composure against pressure. The stillness of a person sitting in a room that had stopped trying to hurt them, learning what that felt like. She said, "There's a woman named Carla in a facility in Indiana." Kyle looked up from his phone. "I know," he said. "Carreras' team has her on the recovery list. She's being transferred to a facility under her real name this week. Her family has been notified." Celine looked at the screen. The news anchor was saying something about the scope of the investigation, the number of victims, the years of documented abuse. The anchor's voice had the specific trained gravity of broadcast news, which made everything it reported feel both important and slightly remote, sealed behind glass. Celine turned the screen off. She sat with her coffee in the quiet kitchen for a moment. "How many?" she said. "The count the investigators are working with is 31 confirmed victims over 22 years," Kyle said, 11 of whom are deceased. The others are alive and in various stages of being located and connected to support. She absorbed this. "The ones who are deceased," she said. "Yes." "He killed them, some directly, some through the conditions they were placed in, some through the process of being moved through the network." He paused. "The evidence from the server is specific enough that the investigators can reconstruct most of the individual case timelines." Celine set the coffee cup down. She lined it up with the edge of the table the way she always lined things up, that small, precise habit. "I should have done it sooner," she said. "You were 17 when you started building the evidence," Kyle said. "You were 26 when you got out. You did what was survivable at each stage. There's no version of this where you failed to do enough." She looked at him. "That's not what it feels like," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not the same as being true." She was quiet. Then, "Did anyone ever tell you you're bad at the comfortable lie?" "Often," he said. She looked at her hands. "I don't want the comfortable lie," she said. "I've had enough of those." She paused. She stopped, looked at the dark screen. "I keep thinking about the ones who didn't get out, and I keep trying to decide what I'm supposed to do with that, whether I carry it or—" "You carry it," Kyle said. "You don't bury it, and you don't let it bury you. It becomes part of the weight of what you do next." She looked at him with an expression that was complex and unresolved and entirely honest. "What do I do next?" she said. "Whatever you decide," he said. "That's the part that's yours." Vernon Crow's trial began 11 weeks after the Blackthorn Hotel. Kyle didn't attend the opening day. He was in a meeting about the operational restructuring of 3 of the Moretti family's remaining legitimate holdings, which had been in limbo since the federal investigation began and required his specific attention to resolve without further legal complication. He had a lawyer on his left and an accountant on his right, and a city outside the window that was doing what cities do, proceeding imperviously through its own concerns. Celine attended. She sat in the public gallery on the left side, 4 rows back, and she watched Vernon Crowe take his seat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that his attorneys had clearly chosen to make him look like what he wasn't. She watched him arrange himself in the chair with the residual habits of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered, the set of the shoulders, the deliberate calm of the hands on the table. And she watched those habits fight against the reality of what the room actually was now and lose. He looked smaller. She'd thought about this moment for years. She'd imagined it in various configurations, what she would feel, what she would do, whether she would be able to look at him directly without the body's old response systems firing. She'd built a version of this moment in her head over a decade, and the version she'd built always involved more. More feeling, more internal upheaval, more of the trembling catharsis she'd seen in films about people who faced their abusers and reclaimed something. What she actually felt, sitting in that gallery watching Vernon Crowe sit down at a defense table, was quiet. Not relief, not triumph, not the warm narrative resolution of a story arriving at its designed conclusion. Quiet. The specific, unfamiliar quiet of a threat that has finally been removed from the room. The quiet of a body that has been running on alert for so long that the cessation of alertness doesn't feel like peace yet. It feels like absence, like the silence after a sound you've stopped hearing because you heard it for so long it became the background of everything. She sat in that quiet for the duration of the opening statements and didn't perform anything for anyone. When she left the courtroom, she stood on the steps outside in the thin November light and called Kyle. He answered on the second ring. "How was it?" he said. She looked at the street, the ordinary traffic, the ordinary pedestrians, the city that didn't know what had just begun inside that building and didn't need to. "Quiet," she said. A pause. "Yeah," he said, like he understood exactly what she meant by it. "Are you done with your meeting?" she said. 20 minutes. "I'll come to you," she said. The estate went on the market in December. It wasn't a decision Kyle made dramatically or with particular ceremony. He walked through the rooms one afternoon, alone, no staff, no meetings scheduled, and looked at what he'd built there, and what it had been built for, and what it would need to be rebuilt as. And he understood with the simple clarity that follows a long period of complexity that the building belonged to a version of the operation that was finished. You didn't renovate a container for a cargo it no longer carried. You found a different container. He kept the study's bookshelves, had them moved to the new place, which was smaller and in a different neighborhood and had the slightly imperfect proportions of a building that had been lived in rather than designed as a statement. The ceilings were lower. The windows looked out onto a street rather than a manicured expanse. It felt, unexpectedly, like a building that could be inhabited by a person rather than occupied by an institution. Celine was the one who found it. She'd been looking, quietly, without presenting it as a collaborative process. She'd sent him an address one afternoon with no context, and he'd driven past it and then walked through it and stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes in the low late afternoon light and understood why she'd sent it. She moved in 3 weeks before he did, not because of anything discussed or decided, but because she had an appointment in the city that ran long and she ended up staying the night, and then the next night, and by the third day her coffee was in the cabinet and her books were on the hall table, and the particular order she kept certain things in had arranged itself through the kitchen in a way that was specific to her and entirely natural. The morning Kyle moved the last of his things from the estate, he stood in the empty study. The bookshelves already gone, the room echoic and light bare, and let himself be there for a minute. In the room where he'd made the list, in the building where the calculation had changed from the one he'd been carrying for 3 years into the one that was now the shape of his actual life. He thought about Luca. He thought, "I think you were right about more things than I told you." Then he locked the door behind him and drove to the new place, where Celine was in the kitchen making something that smelled like garlic and something else. And the bookshelves were already installed against the far wall because she'd arranged it with the moving crew while he was at the estate, and he stood in the doorway watching her cook for a moment before she heard him and turned. "You're late," she said. "I stopped," he said. At the estate? Yeah. She turned back to the stove and adjusted something and said nothing for a moment. Then, was that hard? Not the way I expected, he said. He put his jacket over the back of a chair and stood in the kitchen in the warm smell of whatever she was cooking and looked at the room. Their room. The room they hadn't performed any declaration about, but had simply arrived in by the accumulated motion of the previous months. I thought it would feel like an ending, he said. The building. Didn't it? It felt like something I'd already finished, he said, like closing a book you finished reading last week. The ending already happened. The closing is just administrative. She looked at him over her shoulder. Something in her expression was warm in the specific way that warmth takes, when it's been earned rather than performed. A warmth that knows the cost of itself and carries that knowledge without apology. You're still bad at metaphors, she said. I know, he said. She smiled. A real one. The kind he'd been cataloging since the first time he saw it. Rare, unannounced, arriving in her face the way real things arrive, without preparation or staging. He stayed in the doorway watching it happen and didn't say anything because some things are better received in silence. Sorrel entered a plea in February. 8 years, federal facility. Kyle didn't comment on the sentence publicly or privately. He'd said what needed to be said in the interview room at the field office, and he didn't carry the additional weight of the betrayal because carrying it would only slow down what came next, and what came next required his full capacity. Halford's trial lasted 3 weeks. He was convicted on 11 of 14 counts and sentenced to 23 years. His statement to the press upon sentencing was a 7-minute exercise in institutional deflection that accused the prosecution of political motivation and framed his actions as having been in service of a larger order that the public would someday understand. Cale read the transcript once and set it aside. The 11 counts were sufficient. 3 other members of Crow's network entered plea agreements in the months following Halford's conviction, each agreement contingent on testimony against remaining defendants. The process was long and not always satisfying. The law moved at its own pace, with its own tolerances for delay and ambiguity, but it moved. Carreras called Kyle twice with updates that she wasn't required to share, and he understood these calls as a professional acknowledgement of the cooperation that had made the case viable, and he received them as such without requiring them to be more. Crow's trial lasted 6 weeks. Celine testified on the 4th day. She sat in the witness chair and she answered the questions she was asked in the same precise, level voice she used for difficult things. And she told the truth without performance and without collapsing and without the neat narrative arc of a person finding closure in a single cathartic moment. She told the truth the way a person who has been telling themselves the truth in private for years tells it when a room finally asks, directly, at a cost, with the specific dignity of someone who has already paid for every word before saying it. Crow's defense attorney tried to impeach her testimony twice. Both attempts failed. Cale sat in the gallery for that day. She hadn't asked him to. He told her he'd be there and she'd said it wasn't necessary, and he'd said he knew and he was there anyway, in the 4th row, watching her sit in that chair and do one of the hardest things a person can do, which is to make the private suffering of their own life legible to strangers in a room that requires evidence. He watched her and he didn't look away. And when she found his face in the gallery once, briefly, between questions, he held her gaze for exactly long enough for her to see that he was there, and then he let her return to the work in front of her. After, in the corridor outside the courtroom, she was quiet for a long time. They walked to the car in the cold afternoon and got in, and Price drove, and neither of them spoke for 12 blocks. Then she said, I didn't cry. I know, he said. I thought I would, she said. I've been thinking about it for years, and I thought when it was finally, I thought I'd fall apart. He looked at her profile. You didn't need to fall apart, he said. You already put it together. That's not the same stage. She looked out the window. When does it feel like something? She said. All of it. When does it land? He thought about that honestly. It lands in pieces, he said. Not all at once. You'll be doing something completely ordinary, making coffee, reading something, driving somewhere, and a piece of it will land. You'll know it when it does. She looked at her hands. The city went past the window in its usual indifference, the buildings and the traffic and the people moving through their own arrangements. Okay, she said. He reached across and put his hand over both of hers, briefly, and then returned it to his own side. She didn't look at him when he did it. She just let it happen, and then she let it pass, and then she looked out the window again and breathed. Vernon Crowe was convicted on 31 counts. The sentencing was 3 months after that. Life. No possibility of parole before 25 years. To be served in a federal facility 4 states away from the city he had governed for 2 decades from behind a respectable face. Cale wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. He was in a building in the west side of the city where the first of 3 rehabilitation housing units was being converted from a former warehouse space that had been purchased using money seized from Crowe's network through the legal process. The conversion had been Celine's project. Specifically and technically, and in the practical sense of someone who showed up with architectural drawings and contractor schedules and a specific vision for what the space should do. She'd asked Kyle for 2 things: access to the seized funds through the legal channel that had been established for victim restitution, and the contacts in the city's building department who could expedite permits without requiring a 2-year wait. He'd given her both without conditions. He stood in the half-converted warehouse on the day of Crowe's sentencing and watched construction workers install framing for what would become 12 individual studio units, a common kitchen, a resource room, and a garden space on the south side where the loading dock had been. The building smelled of sawdust and plaster and the specific industrious smell of a space being made into something it hadn't been before. His phone buzzed. A text from Celine. 31 counts. Life. He looked at the text for a moment, then, "Where are you?" Her response came in seconds. "Outside the courthouse. It's cold." He put the phone in his pocket and said something to the site foreman about the framing schedule and walked out of the warehouse into the cold air and got in the car and drove across the city to the courthouse. She was on the steps. Not crying, not celebrating, standing in the thin winter air with her coat closed and her hands in her pockets, and her face doing the complicated thing it did when a piece of something was landing. He parked and walked to the steps and stood beside her. She didn't look at him right away. She looked at the street. "That's it," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's all of it." "Yes." She breathed out slowly. The breath made a small cloud in the cold air and dissolved. "I keep waiting to feel more," she said. "You feel what you feel," he said. "Right now I feel cold," she said. "Then let's go inside somewhere." She looked at him. The cold had put color in her face, a realness to it that the controlled indoor Celine was sometimes too careful to show, and she was looking at him with the direct attention she gave things she'd decided to see honestly, and something in her expression had the quality of a person arriving somewhere they'd been traveling toward for a long time and finding it smaller and more ordinary and more adequate than any version they'd imagined. "There's a place on the corner," she said. "They have good coffee." "All right," he said. They walked down the courthouse steps together and turned toward the corner, and the city moved around them in its usual way. Indifferent, continuous, enormous, a mechanism that generated human experience in industrial quantities without caring much about the individual instances of it. But the individual instances were the whole point. That was the thing Luca had always understood before Kyle, and that Kyle had arrived at through the long route, through a warehouse floor and a debt and a wedding and a woman who walked down an aisle like she was already buried and turned out to be more alive than almost anyone he'd known. The coffee place was warm inside and smelled of roasting and steam and the ordinary commerce of people buying themselves something warm in the middle of a cold day. They got a table by the window and 2 cups arrived, and Selene put both hands around hers, always, still, the both hands thing, and looked out at the street. Kyle looked at her looking out the window. He thought about the night he'd stood at the window of the master suite with his palm against the cold glass and felt the beginning of something he hadn't had architecture for. He thought about how much of what came after had been a process of building that architecture in real time, under pressure, without a plan that fully accounted for what he was building. He thought it had come out adequately, given the materials. "In the spring," Celine said, still looking at the street, "the first housing unit will be open. We can take 12 women initially and expand to 24 by summer if the second warehouse conversion stays on schedule." "It will," he said. "You don't know that." "I know the contractor," he said, "and I know you." She looked at him. "The funding runs for 3 years through the seized assets," she said. "After that, we need another model. I've been talking to 2 foundations and a corporate donor who wants naming rights to the common room, which I told him was fine as long as the name was tasteful. What did he say? He suggested his mother's name, Margaret, which is fine. Margaret, Kyle said. The Margaret Hollins Community Room, she said. It's a good name. It's a good name, he agreed. She looked back out the window. Carla is out of the Indiana facility, she said. She's been placed with a support program in Ohio. I talked to her last week. She paused. She remembered me. From before, from when we were both... From before. She remembered my name. He waited. She said she used to think about me sometimes, Celine said. Wonder if I got out. She said she hoped I did. Her voice was level, but something in it had taken on a texture it didn't always have. She said she was glad. Kale looked at his coffee. You got out, he said. We both did, she said. The street outside was doing its winter afternoon business, the pedestrians moving with the specific pace of people who are cold and purposeful, and the light was the low gray light of a city in late November that still has months of cold ahead of it and is indifferent to that fact. Celine turned from the window and looked at him directly. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask, he said. The morning after the wedding, she said, in the dining room. When you told me about Crow, about what he was doing, about the timeline, you didn't have to tell me. You could have used the information without telling me. You could have managed the whole situation and kept me contained and dealt with it on your own terms. He looked at her. Why did you tell me? She said. He considered the question seriously, not performing consideration, actually turning the question over and looking at the honest answer beneath the various adjacent answers that were easier to give. Because you deserved to know what was happening in your own life, he said. Because you'd been kept from that for 12 years, and I wasn't willing to be another person who decided for you. He paused. And because I looked at you across that table and you weren't what I'd thought you were. And when that happens, when you've been wrong about something important, you have to decide whether to acknowledge it or proceed as if you weren't. She held his gaze. What did you think I was? She said. A consequence, he said, of a debt, a transaction. He looked at his hands. The split knuckles mostly healed now, the skin rejoined over the places where it had opened. I was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. You could have kept it transactional, she said, even after you found out. You could have made the calculation and decided Crow was a problem to solve, and I was a means to solve it. I could have, he said. Why didn't you? He looked at her. Same reason, he said. She held his gaze for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them with its ordinary warmth and its ordinary conversations and its ordinary human business, all of it exactly as it was supposed to be. Nothing extraordinary about any of it, except that they were in it. Kyle, she said. Yes. The scars on my back, she said. They're still there. I know, he said. They don't go away, she said. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought, but they're still there. She looked at her coffee. The ones you can see and the ones you can't. I know, he said again. I need you to know that this... She gestured vaguely between them and the window and the city and all of it. Doesn't make them not there. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. Okay, she said. And the word carried in it something that was not resolution. Not the clean arrival of a story at its designed conclusion, but something realer and more durable than resolution. An acknowledgement. A choice. The specific kind of beginning that only becomes available after you've survived what comes before it. He reached across the table. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she put hers in it, and she let go of the cup, and the winter light moved through the window across both of them, and the city ran its enormous indifferent course outside, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. Months later, when the first housing unit opened and the 12 women moved in and the Margaret Hollins Community Room had its name on the door, and spring was just beginning to show in the narrow strip of garden on the south side where the loading dock had been, Celine stood in the doorway of the common kitchen and watched 3 of the residents make dinner together. She watched them without announcing herself, just for a minute, watched the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, the way conversation started and stopped and started again, the way one of them laughed at something, a real laugh, the kind that comes without warning and doesn't apologize for itself. She stood in the doorway and she let herself feel it. Not triumph, not the narrative satisfaction of having arrived somewhere designed. Something smaller and more true than that. The specific weight of a piece landing, the piece Kael had told her would come in ordinary moments without staging. She felt it, and she stayed with it, and she didn't perform it for anyone. Then she went back to work. Outside, Chicago ran its lights through the season's first warm evening. Not as symbols of anything, not as signals in any story, just as the lights of a city that had no idea what had happened inside its buildings and went on burning anyway, the way cities do, indifferent and endless, and carrying within its 10,000 lit windows all the uncounted private arrangements of people who had survived what they'd survived and were deciding what to do next. The lights burned, the city moved, and that was enough.